be able to. Presently, they can't, therefore I define it as metaphysics.
Yes. Much to their distress. They're like, no, 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 it's not. And you say, oh, I don't know, man. I'm listening to you. And I'm hearing a lot of metaphysics. And they're like, no, you're not. It's not there. Stop it.
I think our modern rationalists are really trying to reduce the metaphysics to a form of physics. Now,
Hmm.
physics deals with objective facts,
Yes.
like a car engine. A car engine, it's going to be the same in China as it is in Australia. But when, for example, we deal with values, which can differ between cultures, we're dealing with something that's metaphysical rather than facts,
Yes.
which, we can objectify facts, but metaphysics, no. Of course, Plato always explains why I can never find the perfect woman, because the
She,
perfect woman is in the world of forms.
that's right. She exists in the world of forms and you don't. Bummer, man. Hey, Sharon, welcome to the call.
Thank
But
you.
Stephen, that perfect woman in the world of forms may serve as a guide to choosing between the real women you meet and making judgments about better or worse.
Okay. Well, we're still living with a hangover of Christianity, which is a hangover of Platonism, that we're indulging in all this metaphysics, which all the people that call themselves rationalists are in hot denial about. And yet at the same time, they'll go on about values. Of course, Nietzsche claimed in The Madman that the Christianity had become the underpinning for Western values. And when you toss Christianity out the window, you've tossed out the values with it. And like a hot rock, the rock will remain hot for a while, but eventually it'll lose its temperature and become cold. And after 2 or 3 centuries, the world would have redeveloped into a type of nihilism unless a set of values, a system of values can be found that can replace Christian ones.
Well, on that cheery note, shall we dive into our session today? I'll paste this in here. So, yeah, 183. We're gonna, for our live stream and our recording, I'll do our spiel. Hello, friends. It's 11:07 on Tuesday, the 24th of March, 2026. At least that's the time in Seattle. So let's begin. Welcome to the 183rd installment of the Kenneth Smith Seminar, our philosophical book club. I'm your moderator, Rick Marshall, coming to you from wet and rainy Seattle, Washington. Seattle's wrapped in her favorite Salish Sea marine layer. Steady drizzle, raining down all night, raining down now in the silver light of this wet, late morning. Yesterday's early risers among my mason bees, fooled by a few warm afternoons, are today huddled snug in their reeds in the bee houses against our home's south wall, watching rainfall on the garden flowers, awaiting the sun's return. We, meanwhile, are continuing our discussion of Kenneth Smith's existentialist philosophy book, Millennia in Microcosm, which compares and contrasts the ancient, medieval, and modernist worldviews. In our first 2 years, we studied the ancient worldview. For the past year and a half, we've studied chapters 5 through 8 about the medieval worldview, in which a religion dedicated to the brotherhood of mankind and the creation of a new kingdom of spirit struggles against the genocidal religious empire erected in its name. Today, we discuss chapter 9, Faith Understood as a Vice, beginning with paragraph 5, in which Smith hints at the problems caused when a priori reasoning, what the Greeks called noesis and Hegel called Verstand, is substituted for genuine spirituality. Although in previous weeks we've supplemented Smith's text with proto-medieval primary source materials, including Q, Thomas, the pre-Pauline Christ myth fragments, and Thessalonians. This week we're taking a break to focus entirely on Smith's writing. It's Kenneth Smith the whole time today, all 3 hours. Kenneth Smith Smith Seminar is organized by Mr. Stillwater's Run Deep, David Roel, who usually writes each week's capsule summaries, but for the last two, he's been quoting the little fragments that I've been texting to him. So I have to stop that, because if I keep doing that, then he won't give us his beautiful little summaries, which I always enjoy. So just a reminder, this seminar is not a show, it's no debate, it's no logic puzzle, it's no attempt to transmit dogmatic philosophical systems. We are an existentialist philosophical book club. Smith is a full-time philosopher, once a philosophy professor, who writes in a dense, allusive style that uses specialized vocabulary and refers to other writers and artists to bring them into the conversation. Together, we explore all those terms and tangents and evocations alongside his main text, and we add our perspectives and experiences and insights into the mix for a rich, patient conversation, not to win, but to philosophize together. So we kick off today with paragraph 5. Now, we did the first couple of sentences of paragraph 5 briefly last time. I'm just going to chuck them into the chat and read them out loud again in order to just jumpstart where we left off. So the first sentence read, "What are the implications of founding a religion on a cult of faith or fideism?" And of course, that sentence is a curiosity, because the main form of religion that most of us in the modern era are familiar with, Christianity, is based on faith or fideism and has presented itself as the ne plus ultra of religion for so long. Most moderns assume that faith and religion are indistinguishable from each other. How could it be a religion if it wasn't founded on faith or fideism? So Kenneth's asking a paradoxical question here. It's deeper than it sounds. He then continues in the second sentence. Without knowing or having to inform oneself, one assures oneself that one already knows all that is essential. Christian fideism, and he's talking about medieval Christian fideism, so modern fideism is another creature entirely, is the degradation of Platonic a priorism into irrationalism, the evolutionarily or rationally retrograde collapse of philosophical culture into dogmatism. So a couple of points of sentence 2. We sort of did these at a rush at the end of the last session. So I want to slow down a little bit on sentence 2 before we dive into sentence 3. And one of the things here is this idea that, although, as Donald points out, and I concur, Kenneth is sometimes unfair to Plato. Sometimes he seems to blame Plato for a lot of things that maybe aren't Plato's fault. Kenneth would be the first to say that Plato is still an Aristos, right? I mean, isn't that what he told you in class, Donald? He says it repeatedly, whatever Kenneth's gripes might be with Plato, he recognizes that his gripes are with an Aristos. He's not talking about, Dualic or Banausic perspectives here. So that he says Christian fideism or medieval Christian fideism is the degradation of Platonic a priorism. He is trying to say that Plato cannot be held responsible for what medieval Christianity did to Platonism. He's trying to say Platonism was a far more sophisticated and nuanced philosophy than what it got turned into by Augustine and others. And then, so this idea of degradation of a priorism into irrationalism is fascinating, because, a priorism is in some ways the signature of rationalism. Much of what we think of as rationalism is it's logic, it's systematized thinking, it's mathematics, it's starting with premises and deriving, according to the rules of logic, deriving valid conclusions and intermediate postulates from those premises. And so to say that there is a degradation of a priorism into irrationalism on the one hand sounds like a contradiction. And in fact, it is a contradiction. Part of what we have to do in these seminars, and even if we're not in a seminar, part of what we have to do as readers of Kenneth Smith is to recognize that in the same way that he says the philosopher Heraclitus really struggled with the Greek language and wrestled with it to try to get it to say things it had never been designed to say. In the same way that he says that Hegel really bent and warped German to try to get it to say things it was never designed to say. In the same way, Kenneth Smith is even more so struggling with modern English to try to get it to say, in some cases, things that Greek and German have no trouble saying. But in English, we can barely, cobble together the idea, even with an entire book, to try to spell out what the hell we're saying and not saying and so forth. So Kenneth here is being caught up on the horns of a dilemma. Hi, Jenny. Welcome to the call. And the dilemma is we don't have, in English, all the words for thinking are pretty much synonyms. It's almost impossible to make clear, sharp distinctions between modes of thought. I mean, the only distinctions that we have are things like pensiveness. Are you being nostalgic in your thinking, like emotive quality? But the kind of sharp distinctions between Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft that Hegel makes in German, or that the Greeks could make between gnosis and noesis, between phronesis and sophron, and countless other distinctions. In Greek and German, these are very clear categories. They mean very important things, and not a single one of them translates into English. Which is why if you read Hegel, if you pick up an English translation of the Phenomenology of Geist, you are in for torture, as they're going to translate Begriff as the notion. Dear God, it's not a notion. And they're going to translate Verstand as the idea. Dear God, it's not an idea. And so you end up with these sentences talking about, the problem with the idea is that it's so abstract, unlike the notion, which is concrete. And there you are going, notions are concrete? When were notions concrete? I don't understand what any of this. This is all gibberish. And this is what happens when you try to translate the clarity of these German words for different forms of thinking into English, in which it's all a vague blur. Brain stuff. We did the brainy thing, thinky, brainy stuff. Everything we've got is a translation for, brainy thinkyism. So the word rationalism in the mid 20th century among philosophical folks was used as a synonym for thinking well, thinking in a sophisticated grown-up way, which is a problem because rationalism also literally means thinking in terms of ratios, which is Pythagoreanism and other forms of mathematical and logical thinking, which is not the grown-up thinking of rationalism. That's, using Hegel's terminology, you've got philosophers trying to use in the mid 20th century, trying to use the word rationalism to stand in for Hegel's Vernunft, the grown-up, mature, sophisticated form of thought. But the problem is that rationalism literally means something more like Verstand, the half-witted, over-intellectualized strategy that so many people venture into. And Kenneth himself, after he quit being a philosophy professor and decided to become a full-time philosopher, he took I guess he took a sabbatical for the rest of his life. But I mean, he took a sabbatical from writing for a bit to focus on reinventing the way that he uses language. He wanted to get disciplined and rigorous about it. He wanted to try to compensate for English's weaknesses by building up a technical vocabulary that he could use to discuss Hegelian, Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean, Arendtian, Aristotelian, Hegelian, all these specific modes of existentialist philosophy to try to, make one-to-one correlations and say, I will always use these words this way and I will never use them that way. But when it came to thinking, I mean, it's what can you do? It's English. They all sort of mean the same thing. And so he goes back and forth in his writing about when is he using rational to mean Verstand, and when is he using rational to mean Vernunft. And in some ways, those things are opposites. And he's stuck using the same word for both of them. It's a big problem. And it's right here in the sentence is the problem. When he says the degradation of a priorism into irrationalism, the reason it's a contradiction is that a priorism is the defining feature of rationalism when rationalism is understood to mean Verstand, right? Noesis, mechanistic, systematized, logical, mathematical thinking. That's rationalism, and it's characterized by a prioris, thinking focused on your premises. So, but he here is using rationalism to refer to Vernunft. When you don't let the logical, systematized, mathematical mode of thought, noesis, when you don't let that rule you, when you mix back in gnosis and begriff to create the dialectic that makes it possible to, kind of struggle your way in the direction of Vernunft, he's using rationalism to mean that Vernunft. And therefore, since a priorism is betraying Vernunft by making Verstand be the master, by making Noesis be the master of your mind, it represents a fall out of Vernunft, out of what he's in this sentence calling rationalism, into Verstand, which in other sentences he calls mere rationalism. So we have a little language problem, and it's not entirely Kenneth's fault. This is the struggle. We talked about this very early on in the seminar. We said every new epoch, as part of defining its worldview as a revolution against the old worldview, it goes about systematically redefining every single important word. Every word that carries significance about life, the universe, or everything, it gets redefined frequently into the opposite of what it used to mean, because the new epoch sees itself as the overturning of the old epoch. And the process of doing that means that if you are trying to talk about insights that are alien to the current worldview, you will find every possible term in your current language has already been redefined to exclude those ideas, to push them into the background, to reduce them to surds. They're unthinkable, they're unexpressible, and every time you try to push against the language to get it to say the things that it's designed not to say, you end up sounding like you're making gibberish, like the degradation of a priorism into irrationalism. It's kind of gibberish, but it's trying to say something that's not at all gibberish, but that modern English is rendering into gibberish. This is my long-winded way of trying to point out a short, simple, but really agonizing problem for philosophizing in modern English. And I'm using his sentence 2 as our example. Questions, comments, or concerns about that? You following what I'm talking about? Ginny, I'm going to drop the link back in the sentences because you joined after. I want you to be able to find the text. We're not doing Paul today. We're just doing Kenneth Smith. So, and we're in chapter 9, paragraph 5. But this is why Kenneth is usually so careful with his language, and why the first time that you read Kenneth, you really can't pick up problems like the one I just pointed out, because you have no way of knowing that he's having to be inconsistent with his use of rational. But after you've spent decades familiarizing yourself with the intent of the philosophy, the character, that you start to become like Nietzsche. You start to become a connoisseur of the character of Kenneth Smith, and that's when you start to notice these moments in the writing where modern English defeats him a little bit. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So it seems to me as though the second part of that sentence, the evolutionary or rationally retrograde collapse of philosophical culture into dogmatism, I can't make the connection between the first part and the second part. Can you help?
I'll help you with that.
Thanks.
That's a great question. That is a great question, Sharon. So yes, why does this go with the other? Well, if for the moment we understand Kenneth to be using the word rationality or rationalism as a synonym for the heuristic way of thought, for Vernunft. Hi, Angelina. Welcome to the call. So if I'll paste back in the sentence we're working on, and then after we get out of this bit, I'll give you more background on where we are. This is from Kenneth Smith's Millennia and Microcosm. And Sharon just asked what is the final clause doing following from the clause before it? And the clause before it is talking about medieval approaches to Christianity as being based on faith and not the other good works and so forth. And he said that when it becomes based on faith only, it's a degradation of Platonic a priorism into irrationalism. And we just talked about how rationalism, irrationalism in English are real problematic words. They're very difficult. They're papering over the difference between two modes of thought that in German you can very easily tell apart. Hegel uses Verstand for ultra-rationalistic, mathematical, logical, systematizing reasoning. And he uses Vernunft for the more adult, whole-minded form of thought, in which you put the irrational back into the picture. And by the irrational, we mean the real world, right? Because the real world doesn't care if it satisfies our logical, syllogisms or not. The rational world, I mean, the real world has its own logic that has nothing to do with human logic. Things happen through cause and effect. They happen because of these system effects. They've been generated, for billions of years. They've been accumulating meaning and consequences. And frequently, if we just try to logic our way to the truth, we end up with a conclusion that contradicts reality. And in Verstand, when reality doesn't obey logic, you just suppress that part of reality. You say, I'm sorry, that doesn't fit my theory. That's an anomaly. I'm just going to push that to the side. But in Vernunft, which Hegel says is the higher form of thinking for human beings, you recognize and admit when your logic is not up to the task of describing reality. This is what science is about, right? You test your logic, you test your reasoning against the evidence of the world. And when the evidence proves you're wrong, you don't just suppress the evidence, you change your theory, you change your premises, right? This is the difference between Verstand and Vernunft is Verstand says, no, my premises are sacred. They must never be questioned. I must suppress that evidence. I just won't publish this study. Whereas the scientific method says, I may have discovered something I don't want, but I discovered it. So I got to publish the study. The study is I went into this thinking this is true, and unfortunately, I just disproved myself. God damn it! Now, would somebody like to fund the next quarter of science so I can try to find out where I went wrong? There is this way in which the grown-up mode of thought, Vernunft, which Hegel's talking about, it requires an acceptance of violations of logic, that reality frequently violates our logic, and we just have to accept that and change our ideas. So a priorism, reasoning from the beginning, from the premises, from what came before, which is priori, is strictly Verstand. It's strictly that, don't let the ugly facts get in the way of my beautiful theory type reasoning. It's what Hegel calls Verstand. And so in this clause where he says degradation of Platonic a priorism into irrationalism, he's using the word rationalism in a weird way to refer to Vernunft and not to Verstand. Normally on these calls, we use rationalism to refer to Verstand, the land of theory reasoning, the I don't want to deal with the facts reasoning. And Kenneth here is he's stretching the word rationalism farther than it can go, to try to make it also refer to Vernunft, which is the opposite of Verstand. Vernunft, when we let the ugly facts in, when we let our theories be overturned, when we acknowledge that systematized thinking is just a tool and it should never be allowed to be the master over the human mind, because the real world is not impressed by our logic. So the question that Sharon just asked is, what does the final clause have to do with what we just discussed? And the final clause is the evolutionarily or rationally retrograde collapse of philosophical culture into dogmatism. And the connection, Sharon, is this. What Kenneth here called rationalism, what Hegel calls Vernunft, what the Greeks might call aristeia, is the mode of thought in which you say, there are no simple answers to be found in my feelings or my experiences. I mean, they have some truth, but they're parochial. That's the problem. I can't see the bigger picture. And there's some truth to be found in abstract reasoning and logic and going to school, right? I can learn systematized thinking. I can learn patterns. I can try to predict the future. Logic might help me. Math might help me. But it too is a problem because it's so abstract. I can theorize things that are actually false in the real world. I mean, I like to express it as the difference between truth and validity, logical validity, is that for every 100 logically valid statements, 99 of them are false. They're valid, but they're false. They obey the rules of logic, but your premises were wrong. And so it doesn't matter how well you derived these from your premises. That could be valid every step of the way, but you started from the wrong place. And so you're describing something that can only be true in the land of theory. This is the Verstand. This is the ultra-rationalism. This is a priorism. And the problem with Verstand and a priorism is that one gets too overconfident in one's own products of the mind. I reasoned it out, so it must be true. And I'm going to go on the internet and tell everybody who disagrees with me they're wrong. And if they try to push back, I will show them my beautiful argument, and they must submit because I am the master. Because behold, this is dogmatism, right? My ideas have to win, and I gotta beat them into everybody. And as Hegel writes, and as Kenneth is alluding to here, it is a really small step to go from logic to dogmatism. What? It's valid. You have to obey. These are the law. It's the law. It's the law of logic. Now submit. Submit to me. I must win. It is. They're just a hair's breadth away from each other. When we descend out of Vernunft and Aristeia into Verstand, this ultra logical, ultra rational, dogmatic thing, we lose the leash that reality and the ugly facts have put on our thinking, that humble us, that teach us that our thinking is maybe better than nothing, but it's not all that great, and we should take it with a grain of salt, right? It's the advantage of science, is like, that is a beautiful theory. Now here are 18 facts that contradict it. That we learn to humble ourselves. We can't be dogmatic if we're being philosophical, if we're being whole-minded, if we're engaging in Vernunft, if we're behaving like an Aristos. Dogmatism is for this, it's for this half-witted mode in which we don't let reality into the picture. We defend ourselves from reality. We rationalize our arguments. We put our thumb on the scales of justice and push hard to make sure everything always comes out the way that our preferred beliefs and ideas do. So he's saying there, when he talks about a retrograde collapse of philosophical culture into dogmatism, part of what he's saying, Donald, is he's apologizing to Plato, right? Because Plato is an actual Aristos. He actually has Vernunft. His mode of thinking is far more sophisticated than what the medievals are going to do with it later. He actually does factor in the real world to the best of his ability, and he does think dialectically, trying to pit the experiential side of his mind against the logical, rational side of his mind. But when you get into this medieval mode where people are talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and they're trying to derive it logically from the premises that they believe about angels, and not in the slightest from going out into the world and looking for angels to see what their actual characteristics are like, we're now no longer dealing with Platonic philosophical reasoning. We've now dropped back down from Vernunft to Verstand and just trying to logic our way to victory. This is what he means by the collapse, a retrograde collapse into dogmatism. Notice again the use of the word rationally. This is for Stephen's benefit. So once again, here he's trying to use the word rationally as a synonym for Vernunft, for Aristeia, instead of the way we use it on these calls. And instead of the way that Kenneth uses it in other passages, where he acknowledges that rationalism is just a kind of a priorism, it's just a kind of logic, mathematic, it's just a kind of dogmatism, if you will. But this is the struggle that we have with modern English. Modern English doesn't give us the words to discriminate the different modes of thought the way that Greek and German do. So even when Kenneth has something very crisp and clear he's trying to say, you render it into English, and you get some of the same effect here in sentence 2 that you get when you try to read an English translation of the Phenomenology of Geist by Hegel. There's a certain amount of gibberish in here, and it's not his fault. He's trying to say something very clear. It's the English doing it to him. So I hope that helps, Sharon. You ask what it has to do with it. You should ask, because it is a little unclear, because we just don't have the words in English to make the distinctions. And it's why one of the places where I differ a little from Kenneth is I inflict a little more German and Greek on the people I talk to than Kenneth does. He's trying to make it more accessible by sticking to English more often. But I think in the case of sentence 2, it's working against him. If he had rephrased this in terms of Verstand and Vernunft, it would have been absolutely crisp what he was saying, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Does that help at all, Sharon?
Yes, because I'm not sure, because the second part of the sentence almost seems contradictory to the first part. A priorism is something that's instinctive. It's Platonic instinctiveness, and that's supposed to be irrational. And then over a period of time, the philosophical culture becomes more dogmatic, more sure of itself. So it's just like I can't get which is it.
So what if we don't think about a priorism as instinct? What if we think about a priorism as logic?
Okay.
So where you're deriving your new ideas from your old ideas. Your old ideas become your premises, and you just accept them a priori without question.
Mm-hmm.
Like man is mortal. There, it's a premise. I'm just going to accept it. And I'm not going to question it. I'm not going to go look around and see if I can find a Lazarus anywhere. I'm just going to assert it. Now, that's a priorism. You just
Could I point out something?
please go ahead, Stephen.
We're using one idea as a measure of other ideas. As we have the monarch, we take his foot as a basis for the measurements of all distance. So in some way, rationalism, which is a word meaning measure,
Yeah.
means, well, we can measure the objective world in various ways, and we can establish that objectively. But how do you measure thought? How do you measure the mind? But somehow we seem to be striving to do it.
Yes.
And the metaphysics.
Yes.
I take one, or for example, when I had what is commonly called thought arise when I was about 5 months old, it began to operate when I developed, what do they call it, sequential memory. I suddenly realised I'd been in one place before, so I was here now. And I'd been here yesterday, so I had 2 memory images. Memory is abstracted into a type of thought. I have 2 memory images. There's some sort of machinery that starts to show up, which somehow this machinery has some sort of concept of time.
Yes.
So is it all purely empirical in origin? Did I get all my concepts purely from the externals, or is there some type of machinery which is operating with the inputs?
And these are questions we really want to be able to answer because, how much should we trust our own ideas? How much should we trust other people's ideas? What can be our basis for making decisions and going forward? It all depends on the answers to these questions you're asking. And as you point out, it's an enormous problem for us that we can't just like hold up a ruler to the inside of our brain and derive any answers. If I want to know who's tallest, I can just go get, measuring tape and the problem is solvable. But if I'm trying to figure out who's thinking the most clearly, all of a sudden, all of my, weights and measures that they're useless. And we're struggling. And this is why Heraclitus talks a lot about how it's every bit as important to devote as much time to studying our inner nature as it is to study the outer nature, because this is the lens through which we see everything. And if it's warped, then we're not going to see any of this clearly. We need to know what these warps are so that we can unwarp what we think this is to try to get closer to the truth. But the problem is studying in here, it's all invisible to us. We can feel it. Sometimes we can hear our thoughts. We can write them down. We can say things out loud and hear what we said and go, "Ooh, do I agree with that?" Which is like the center of Shakespeare's style of writing. But none of that is anywhere near as helpful as I look over there and I point at the tree and you look at the tree and we both see it's got flowers. We're like, "Hey, that tree is flowering. We can agree on it." It is a much more difficult problem to figure out what is going on up here. Yeah. So thank you, Stephen.
Well, in a way, for example, you obtain a memory image. And when you've got that, you can abstract it into predictions. A memory image is something that's happened. It's objective in a way. It actually happened.
Yes.
But you can think, well, this happened yesterday. I can abstract that into a possible prediction of what I'm going to do tomorrow. And this is what I call thought.
Yes. So let's since we've got some new folks on the call, first of all, welcome to the call, Angelina, John, and Randy. I know John, you've been here before, I think, but Randy and Angelina, I don't think we've met before. We are jumping. We're at 183 in our series of weekly seminars. We got a few off here and there, but it's so we've been doing this for a few years now, and we're working our way through a common book, and the book is Millennia and Microcosm by Kenneth Smith. It's an existentialist philosophy book. And in it, he spends the first 4 chapters trying to get us to understand the ancient worldview. And now we're in the section he's trying to get us to understand the medieval worldview. And then in the end of the book, he'll come back and look at the modern worldview, but he'll use the other 2 worldviews and what we learned about how to see through their eyes to help us look at the modern world through their eyes and to be able to criticize it in ways that the modern world is incapable of criticizing itself. Because the thing he points out is each epoch makes a bunch of assumptions about how the world works, what is a person, what is nature, what is sacred, and then it can't think clearly about those assumptions. Like a fish can't discover water because the water's there all the time. And when you've been living for 500 years in modernism, you really are in no position to understand what modernity even is, because you have a sample size of 1, modernity. That's all we know. It's all we're in. And the only way that we usually understand the medieval or the ancients is through caricatures. We lie about them. Haha, those stupid medievals. We showed them. We won. They lost. They're the Dark Age and we're the Enlightenment. These are the sorts of cliches we tell ourselves, little bumper sticker assumptions. And the ancients, well, that's even older. And as we know from the name modern, we value what's new and we hold in contempt what's old. So ancient, that's like really old. So that must be really contemptible. So whenever we talk about the ancients, we talk about them on the one hand as, oh, they're so much more primitive than we are. They didn't know anything. They're all superstitious. Haha, isn't it great to be us? But on the other hand, we sometimes will acknowledge, like the Athenians, we might say, hey, those Greeks weren't too bad. And what we mean by that is we see a little bit of ourselves in them and we love ourselves. So we're willing to grant a little bit of that love to them and say, oh, they're like little baby versions of us. How cute. And maybe if they came to our world, they would admire us like gods. And these are the sorts of things we tell ourselves about the past. We have these wild caricatures and assumptions and prejudices. And what all of that leaves out is the possibility that Kenneth Smith is discussing in this book. And the possibility is, what if we're not absolutely better than other worldviews? What if each worldview gets some things right and some things wrong? And being a modern means that the things that we get wrong, which we can't tell we're getting wrong because we take them for granted, those are the sorts of things that somebody from a different epoch might look at and immediately see what's wrong with it. They might understand why it's a problem in a way that we can't, because to us it's invisible. So if we can learn to see through these different worldviews, we can turn them on each other, and each of them can start to critique each other. And we can start to have a dialectical relationship to our own worldview instead of just taking it for granted as an a priori that we can't question. That's the purpose of the book. And it's going to take us a few years to do this. So, we did 2 years of ancient. We're now a year and a half into medieval. I think it'll be another year and a half. Hi, Randy. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. You have been here before. That's right. That's right. So it'll probably take us another year and a half to get through the medieval worldview, mainly because we're having to peel back a lot of the modernist distortions of what it means to be medieval. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm just going to say, Christian fidelism is a big question, isn't it? Plato's position, he believed in the soul. He believed in more or less a sort of what became a division later into the upper man, the godlike man, the man of the values, and there's the lower man, the man of the passions, the man who likes to conquer, the man who likes all the appetites and will genocide the other tribes so he can have more of the world for himself. Now, Plato made this claim that there's this divine aspect of ourselves, which we see in Christianity. So Christianity says, yes, I know you're the animal man. I know you have appetites. I know you like to genocide your neighbor, but there's a faculty in you that can raise you above that. And this faculty is valid. Now, what the modern fools have done, as Nisha pointed out, they've thrown out this faith without realizing this is the same faith in those type of values we call morals. The Christian really did believe that, being, noble and nice to the rest of humanity is the way to go, and it has a foundation. It's not just some silly abstract concept in your head. There's a real direction there. That direction is given by something divine, according to Plato. For the Christians, becomes their gods. So, like the a priori faculty of the minds, there is this similar faculty which becomes the basis for the fidelism, which is, Plato's soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, we're going to run through this framework a little bit today. It's going to help us to understand paragraph 5. John, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, Rick. So yeah, I see what you're saying with the modernist view of everything, with like, oh, that was a couple hundred years ago. They were idiots back then. But one thing is that when it comes to religion, specifically religious texts, people seem to have the opposite view of that. They seem to be, oh, is that like a new view on like God and religion? That's illegitimate because it's very recent, but it's not a couple thousand years old like these ancient texts are. So I was just wondering about your input on that.
Yeah, there's a tug of war, right? There's a culture war going on, and we can see it in front of us right now. There is a way in which, and the modernist stuff will really be able to do justice to 2 years from now, after we finish the medieval section and have started back into modernity, because we'll be able then we'll all share kind of this ancient perspective and this medieval perspective, and we'll be able to agree somewhat on what they would have to say about modernity. But one of the things that Kenneth often says, and he's echoing Kierkegaard in this, is that modern Christians are utterly different from medieval Christians, but they don't think they are. They frequently think that they're being true to the past, and they are honoring, the roots of their religion. And as Kierkegaard points out, they often think that exactly while they're betraying the roots of their religion. It's frequently the case that the modern approach to spirituality and God and Jesus, it would get you burned at the stake in the Middle Ages, for example. Or if you went back to Jesus and Paul, that Jesus might be shaking their heads going, I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you worshiping wealthy people? Why are you worshiping militancy? What the hell is this? I don't understand what I'm seeing here. Or he might say, I understand exactly what I'm seeing, and you are not followers of mine. And this would come as a horrible shock to millions of modern Christians who assume that because they have faith that they're Christians, that ipso facto they are Christians, that they are whatever they say they are. And they've decided that they're Christians, and ergo they are Christians. But it's legitimate, as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and others said, to ask the question, would Jesus have considered you Christians? Would Paul have considered you Christians? What do you mean by Christians? You got to be able to ask these searching questions. So there's this way in which there's to a modern Christian, they're caught in a tug of war between, on the one hand, wanting to be true to what they actually believe now, but also wanting to brand themselves based on something that is from an earlier epoch they don't understand. None of us understand, because we're so acculturated into modernity. And one of the ways that tension expresses itself is by kind of overtly being contra modern. Get me, I'm pushing back against all the modern sinfulness. I'm actually, I'm actually attached to these older things, and I don't trust the newer things. And the irony is that frequently the people saying that are themselves new, and their belief system is new, and it would be unrecognizable to the people that they claim to be embracing. And I'm not trying to mock them by doing this. This is what Kenneth is talking about in this book. Is he's saying, if we've only ever all lifelong been immersed in a single worldview, modernity, We've never been immersed in medievalism because that's been gone for 500 years. And we've never been immersed in the ancient worldview, which has been gone for 2,000 years or 1,500, depending on where you draw the line. Then we're the fish in the water. We don't know about water. We don't know what we're taking for granted. We don't know how it compares or differs from the beliefs that we have. We have no frame of reference, and that means that we are going to be victims of our own assumptions. We're going to be making assumptions about what the past was like and what the present is like in contrast to the past. And without any clear metrics, without any basis for comparison, we don't know if any of it's true. And so it becomes an a priorism, right? It is a perfect example of taking for granted. We take for granted who we are, but we don't have a frame of reference to compare ourselves to know if that's who we are. There's a lot of fight back and forth over the brand Christian. Who gets to call themselves a Christian, and who doesn't, who should not call themselves a Christian because they don't agree with Christian values. And the current modern assumption is it belongs to whoever wants to call themselves a Christian can, whether they are or not. And what it means to not be a Christian isn't very clear in the modern world. What would it take? What would my behavior have to be like for someone to be able to say that man is definitely not a Christian? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer, but it would not have been hard to answer in Paul's time, as we've just spent the last couple of months looking at the pre-Pauline Christ myth fragments, and we looked at Thessalonians for the 2 weeks prior to that, and Paul's pretty clear about what he thinks a Christian is. And next week we're going to start into Galatians, and in Galatians he really gets into what he thinks a Christian is and is not, because he has a big beef in Galatians with people who are saying you have to follow Jewish law. And he gets really angry. It's sort of astonishing in Galatians how rude he is in the opening. The part where you're supposed to give thanksgiving, he's basically writing WTF. What are you saying to me right now? I am astonished. It's like, wait, where's the part where you're thankful for something? Paul's like, I'm not thankful for anything right now. I'm just angry. And so he's got opinions about this stuff. And that's typical of his age. The Greeks were every bit as strong about the negative, the taboo, the forbidden, the dangerous, what is not to be done, as they were about the positive, what they thought you should do. We talk about the Greek myths, and we talk about their gods, and we talk about their stories, but we're missing a whole bunch of stuff that they have about that which must not be done, that which you should not say or do. And they thought the punishments were like immediate. You see traces of this in the Greek myths, like the myth about Arachne, who brags that she's as great a weaver as Athena. And she comes and has a contest with Athena, who turns her into a spider. It's like, boom, that's your punishment for daring to compare yourself to Athena. And a modern reads that and goes, I guess Athena has thin skin, right? We don't understand what that's about. We think that must just be Athena's just mean. We like Athena from other stories, so we think, well, we don't know why Athena's mean in this story. So then we forget about the story later on because it doesn't fit with our picture of Athena. But to the Greeks, that was an essential part of Athena's character. To be divine is not to be human at all. And for a human to think that they were divine, to think that a god is merely a powerful human being, which is what moderns typically say, or superheroes, Superman, Batman, Captain America, all these people, we sort of fantasize that gods are just powerful people. Maybe they're wiser, but they're definitely stronger. So if we were strong enough, like we had nuclear weapons, maybe we would be gods. And you can read a lot of propaganda in which people imagine that people from the past, if they came to the present, they would worship us like gods. And we flatter ourselves with that. And it's because we can't conceive of the sacred. We actually have no idea of what something's like that could be utterly alien to the human, that could transcend it in every way. So, why is Arachne turned into a spider? Because she's, from a Greek perspective, she's a flaming idiot. She has lost track of the difference between the sacred and the profane, the human and the divine. She thinks just because she's a good weaver, that makes her a goddess. In other words, she's thinking like a modern. And from the Greek perspective, that will be your destruction if you can't be clear about what's sacred and what's not. So I guess my point is, it's the Greeks They have all this terminology and all this theoretical framework for discussing the things people should not do. And we don't have any of that. We just sort of have, well, if you're strong enough, do whatever you want. Maybe there's things you oughtn't to do, but if you have enough money, nobody can stop you, right? That's just how it is. Whereas the Greeks had this idea that if nobody can stop you, you'll destroy yourself. This is the story of Oedipus, the story of the Peloponnesian War. All of these things are illustrations of what happens when people are not leashed to a level of power commensurate to the level of wisdom that they have. So anyway, so
Thanks,
let's.
Rick.
I hope that was a little helpful. So let's look at this framework a little bit, and we're going to move a little further into paragraph 5. So I'm going to give you some framework and then propose a different way to read sentence 2, so that we can understand what he's saying and move on. So the second part of the framework, which some of the folks on this call know very well, and others maybe not as much, is the doulos, benausos, aristos, the 3 character types according to Greek characterological psychology. And we start with the doulos. And a doulos is one of the many Greek words for slave. And a doulos means somebody who's not a slave by accident. It isn't just that they were unlucky and someone's kidnapped them and turned them into a slave. It's not somebody it's not like the way we use the word slave in the United States. It applies to all these people we kidnapped from Africa. And we stole them. We militarily grabbed them. We stole them. We dragged them across here and we forced them to work for us. And we use the word slave for that. And so when we translate in the modern world, we translate doulos in ancient Greek as slave in modern English, we create a confusion that the Greeks never would have had. The Greeks have an entirely different word for somebody who is just unlucky. It's not their fault. They're not actually a slave. They're actually a free person, and they've been temporarily imprisoned and are being treated like a slave when it's unjust. And that word is not doulos. Doulos is their word for somebody who is a slave by nature. Whether they're free or captured, whether they're working for somebody else or whether they own a giant estate and have slaves of their own, either way, a doulos is a doulos in ancient Greek. And a doulos means somebody who they think entirely using the first of the 2 faculties of the mind, the gnosis, in its naive form. They're very attached to what they feel. They're very attached to what they sense, what they experience, what they remember, and they're driven by those things. And they really don't like logic or mathematics, or they don't trust education. They don't want to reason things out. And the reason is, if you do those things, you separate yourself from the rich, powerful, addictive flow of experience. Douloi are addicted to being immersed in the flow of the world. They're this here now is a phrase that the Greeks and the Germans use for like the life of my cats. My cats don't spend a lot of time thinking about their personality types. They're attached to this here now. If a bug flies in, they drop everything they do and they chase the bug. They can't help it. It's a bug. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, it's a bug. This here now, the present is 100% of their attention. Almost 100%. It's not that they don't have the other capacity. It's not interesting to them. And that's what a doulos is like. Having a good meal, screwing around, getting into fights, fighting back against people who make you angry. All this stuff is very doulic. And that doulic stuff comes as a result of they have embraced one of the 2 faculties of their mind and they've rejected the other one. They reject noesis, but they embrace gnosis. And by having gnosis without noesis, gnosis is only able to half deliver what it's capable of delivering. We evolved to have both faculties because they're supposed to check each other and build off each other, correct each other, right? But if you kick the crutch away from either of the faculties, it's now hobbling. It's not able to live up to its full potential in Homo sapiens. And that's the experience of a doulos. And to the Greeks, a doulos is a doulos regardless of their money or their power or their freedom or their captivity. It doesn't matter. It's a character trait, not an economic status. And Aristotle writes at some length about the ways in which economies and politics in ancient Greece can get this wrong. They could give somebody politically or economically the status of a doulos who wasn't a doulos. And Aristotle says that's a terrible crime. If somebody's a Benausos or an Aristos, you should, and you are treating them like a doulos, you are doing wrong. You should set them free at once. They don't belong there. You're screwing things up. That might be the guy who's going to save the whole city if he's in charge. And instead, you've got him digging ditches, you idiots. Aristotle felt very strongly about this. And he said that the converse is true. To have a doulos running your city is a curse. I mean, that doulos could lead the whole city into disaster through his appetites and his fears and his, day-to-day hallucinations. Basically he's living in an emotive dream state, and God knows what horrendous choices he's going to make for everybody. You have to immediately pull that person out of that position of authority and put them to a political economic level where they can't hurt anybody. Because douloi hurt people through their inability to plan ahead and their inability to think separate from their own ego and appetite. So, although this is related to political economy, it's also separate from political economy. And Aristotle makes that crystal clear. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I think you're giving the servile classes, too good a rap. Most people would rather live with somebody else taking the responsibilities and somebody else making the decisions. Most people would rather enjoy themselves, play with their belly button, eat chocolates and watch their favorite TV drama. Now, this is Kierkegaard as well. Kierkegaard is basically pointed this out about himself. He was living the life of a child. He didn't want to take on responsibility. He didn't want to marry Regina. What was the name of Regina Olsen? Because he's living the student's life. He's living an extended childhoods. His favorite activity is probably hanging around in the snaps bars of the other students arguing stuff. He's living the life of a child. He doesn't want the responsibilities. He realizes being in the marital state is taking on responsibility. And then he realizes there's a state above that, and that's a state where you've become a leader. You're doing the hard thinking for the others. Now, if I was, say, reading, those Icelandic sagas, this is clearly visible. You have a whole series of chieftain hierarchies. You have the leader of a household. The leader of a household will have, a few relatives, but he'll also have a lot of people who are, just very much a servile class. They're way down in the pecking order. Maybe about half the household is really on the lower end of the pecking order. But there's a reason, because the guy who's running the farm, who's the head honcho, has to do the hard thinking, has to take the responsibilities. He has to tell the other guy, can just come up and say, "Hey, brain, what am I going to do now?" And this goes up the hierarchy. So you get this guy, he's just running his own little plot of land, his own farm, which is like a little ranch. And then there's one guy above 10 ranches who becomes a sort of a minor chieftain. Oh, I'll do the heavier thinking and relate to the bigger politics for the guy down the hierarchy. And you just get these hierarchy of chieftains. So you get a guy who's working on the really hard issues that, it detracts from the things that you really enjoy doing, watching Star Trek while you're eating chocolates. That's where I want to be. I want to be in my own little natal space, playing with my belly button. Don't give me any responsibilities, man. Don't give me the questions of leadership. So in a sense, the servile person is enjoying a subtle luxury in not having the responsibilities and not having to make the hard decisions, which really tear at your soul. He can just expects the master to take the responsibility and to make the decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity to these relationships. They're incredibly complicated, and they're complicated by the fact that whatever truth there might be in them is also buried under centuries of people using these frameworks as excuses to do things that the Greeks would have thought appalling. So, the slave masters of the US South were constantly claiming to be Aristoi, and were claiming that the people that they'd kidnapped and put to work were douloi. And they would say all these the same kinds of things you're saying. They would say that about these free people that they had imprisoned and kidnapped. And it's also the case that if you keep people imprisoned and through multiple generations, and you treat them like douloi, it has a massively damaging, distorting effect on their character. So you can warp people who might have grown up to be Aristoi until they're not capable of doing that anymore. And that's a theme we'll come back to a lot in this session. So on the one hand, you've got that sort of.
Just wondering about that one, Rick, because the southern plantation owners bought their slaves. The people who had kidnapped the slaves had been people in the African states.
Yes, but after they bought their slaves, they then rationalized why they should be allowed to keep them. And the rationalities were often paper thin. I mean, if Aristotle was concerned about the occasional doulos who was in government and shouldn't have been there, he would have been appalled by what was in the US South. Because in the US South, hardly any of the upper class were Aristoi. We had an enormous number of appetitive and Banausic people who were in charge and crowning themselves Aristoi when they fundamentally weren't. So my point isn't to refute anything you said. It's to say, and I'm going to come back to the comments in the stream in a moment, but it's to say what complicates this is that on the one hand, there's the things that you're talking about, which really happened in ancient Greece, and on the other hand, you've then got centuries of people using that as a justification for something that was quite different, but that they didn't want to admit was different. So it's all of this stuff around slavery is very hard to talk about clearly, because again in English we don't. Ancient Greek has separate words for you don't have the character of a slave, but you're being treated like one, versus regardless of whether you're free or not, you have the character of a slave. They have completely different words and they're completely different concepts. And in English, we call them both slave. We use the same word to translate both, which is terrible because it implies that if somebody kidnaps you, ipso facto, your character now changes and you have the character of a slave. Or it suggests that nobody exists who has a slavish personality when, we all meet people like this every day. I mean, Darwin awards are given out to people who, by their appetites alone, they led themselves into catastrophe, like, trying to steal from a bank and locking themselves in the safe. I mean, there's all this stuff that happens for people who can't think ahead and can't think clearly about the world. We know they exist. But on the other hand, to accuse them of it sounds like we're saying that we believe we ought to be able to buy and sell them and own them and make them work for us. And all of this is confusion in our language and history. It's another example of what we talked about early today. Modern English is just a terrible language for talking about these difficult issues in human character. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I think both of y'all are pretty right. It's not the your class status. It's your inability to rule, and that starts with oneself. So, I go back in this, you're quite right about Aristotle, and I think every modern should read, his defense of slavery is in the Nicomachean Ethics, and in the modern response, I've been in a few seminars where that book was read, and when we hit that passage, it's, well, we probably shouldn't listen to anything that Aristotle says. It's clear he's some sort of, I don't know what.
He's a dirty slaver.
Yeah, it's what I don't know what word you want to call him, but certainly you're free to ignore him. Just like we want to ignore, our own founding. We can, although Aristotle was superior in that he did not have the flaws of which he's talking about when he discusses slavery. Because it's, if you would, for people who would read that portion of the Nicomachean Ethics, you would understand that modernity makes all kinds of allowances for wage slavery, debt slavery. We enslave people all the time. We just have developed a vocabulary so that we don't have to confront what Aristotle says.
We tell them they're free.
Yeah, go and be free. And that's I think we don't think about this well, and this is good for us to discuss this. I mean, I'm not saying I don't know. I see on Meetup and philosophical, so we're going to read the Nicomachean Ethics. We're going to read the Nicomachean. I encourage that. Read it, but understand it. Don't reject it. It's not there just to feel superior. Oh, gosh, we've come so far since Aristotle. And the other thing is, we don't get to blame this one on Plato. He did. Oh, I'm not sure he felt any differently.
Thank you, Donald. So before I call on Stephen, we got two comments from the live stream that David shared with us in the chat, and then we'll come back to Stephen. So the first question is a comment from stream. What about Medusa? She didn't do anything but was cursed. And yes, for those of you who weren't familiar with the story, better than Wikipedia as a source about the Greek myths is the website Theoi. If you're not familiar with theoi.com, I encourage you to check it out. I just put a link in the chat. And there's a link to their article about the curse of Medusa in Greek mythology. So, the rule was you couldn't be a priestess of Athena unless you were a virgin. Medusa ends up being raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena. And Athena punishes Medusa by taking away her beauty and turning her into the monster with the incredibly ugly with the snakes for hair, and she's doomed to be that way until eventually Perseus cuts her head off. So the commenter is right to ask, what did she do wrong? Well, this is one of the big differences in the conception of gods. When we hear that the Greeks worshipped many gods, we assume they mean gods like we understand gods to be, right? I mean, we assume it's some version of Jehovah. Maybe it's a Greek Jehovah and it's a woman Jehovah and a virgin Jehovah. And maybe they're not powerful over everything, but only over crafts and wisdom and excellence in battle. And we make our list and we say, but other than that, we still think it's like Jehovah and that the worship relationship is pretty much the same. Praise me, it's part of our covenant. You have to praise me and, then I'll look out for you. But that's not what the Greeks thought at all. At all. Ancient polytheism is an entirely different kind of religion. It's not just they have multiple Jehovahs. They don't have any Jehovahs. It's a completely different kind of thing. The ancient Greek conception of the gods is that they reflect aspects of nature that are more powerful than we are and affect our lives. And if we don't keep track of them and learn their character and try to, no, we're going to talk about it. It's really important to this. It's if we don't, we should think of ourselves like mice in the African grass when elephants are fighting around us. If we don't watch where they are and get out of their way, they're going to crush us. We have to understand that we are not gods. Things have authority over us. We're not pure, perfect egos who are able to act in the world and make things the way we want. We're stuck in a tug of war between what we intend to happen and the actual fortunes of the circumstances around us. I mean, sometimes somebody might be on their way to winning the race, and unfortunately, a landslide hits and they're knocked over. And the other racers who are slower than they are run by, and somebody else gets the gold medal. The best racer doesn't get the gold medal, and they did nothing wrong at all. It was just bad fortune. And moderns don't like that. We like to try to make everything into a meritocracy, and we'll say, well, if he'd been really clever, he would have known that he would have studied the race course in advance and discovered that there was going to be a landslide. And the Greeks just laugh at that. They're like, oh, you think you're a god? You think you can know everything? Of course you can't know everything. It is in the nature of being a mortal that we're going to be blindsided by things that are not our fault, but they happen to us anyway. And that's what it means to be alive. We're going to, how our life turns out is partly up to us and partly up to circumstances. And to try to reduce it to either one, the Greeks would have considered a kind of half-witted mode of thought. They held it in contempt. So the story about Medusa isn't a story about her doing. This is why it's a great question from the stream. You're absolutely right. She didn't do anything, but she was cursed. And that's because none of the gods is good or evil in ancient Greek mythology. In ancient Greek mythology, they're no more good or evil than a volcano is good or evil, or a river. And the same Nile River that sometimes creates the sediment that allows you to farm and feed your family is the same one that will flood and wash your village away. It has authority over you. It has power over you. And that means that power will sometimes do good for you and sometimes do evil for you. But either way, you better keep your eye on it because it's bigger than you are. It's deeper than you are. It's more authoritative than you are. That's what they thought Athena was, and Zeus, and Poseidon, and Hephaestus, and all the rest. They're aspects of nature, of the natural world, that have authority over us. So yeah, Medusa's screwed, and it's not her fault. That's the point of the story. And it exemplifies how different the Greek concept of a god is from the modern concept of a god. And by extension, as well, as we're going to see as we dig deeper into medieval theology, it's also completely different from the medieval conception of a god. Because, of course, in the medieval conception, there's only one God, and that God is all good and only good. So what happened to Medusa could never have happened if, Jesus were in charge, according to the medieval worldview. So it's a great comment from the stream. Thank you for making it. I really appreciate it. This other comment from the stream I'll do before Stephen as well. What about contentment? Could that be seen as doulos as well? No. Contentment is very different. A doulos is somebody who is ruled by their feelings. They could be ruled by contentment. But anybody could feel contentment or desire contentment. The question is, how do you relate to contentment? Are you willing to do anything to feel good? And for the doulos, the answer is yes, of course. Who would want to feel bad? But a Banauso says, sometimes we have to be willing to experience some discomfort in order to achieve longer term goals that are more important, right? So maybe I don't eat breakfast when I want to because I've got 3 kids and they're hungry. I'm hungry, they're hungry, and they have to get to school. So I'm going to feed them first and send them off to school. And then I'm going to eat. I defer my immediate reward in order to achieve the larger reward of being able to take care of them and me and not just myself. I'm not just sitting there chowing down on Twinkies, laughing and pointing at them and laughing, going, ha ha, I'm content and you're not. I can defer. Or if you practice martial arts and you say, I want to become a black belt, but that means I'm going to have to do a lot of difficult workouts and I'm going to sweat and my muscles are going to ache. And I'm going to be tired a lot of the time. There's going to be days I don't want to do it. And I'm going to do it anyway, because I know the longer I do this, the better I'll get. So I'm willing to sacrifice momentary contentment in order to achieve a greater contentment later on. The doulos won't make that trade. The doulos is, why would I ever give up the pleasure of the moment? Why would I ever endure the pain of the moment? Just because of some imaginary future? Live each day as though it's your last. See that bumper sticker? That's the doulic motto in a nutshell. This here now is the only important part. Don't save up your money, spend it all right now. Why not? You could be happier today if you just, I want to buy that thing that I want. Oh, now I don't have any savings and I lose my home. Oh, well, who could have foreseen this? Not a doulos. But a Banausos could have foreseen it because Banausoi are skeptical about their own appetites, as we're going to talk about in a moment. So contentment is not so much you can't draw a direct equation from contentment to douleia, but what you can do is use contentment as a test and say, how would a doulos respond and relate to contentment versus how would a Banausos, which we'll talk about next, respond or relate to contentment versus how would an Aristos respond or relate to contentment? And the answer in all three cases is different. And that's what makes them different from each other. It's the way that they relate to these things. It's a great question. It'll take the rest of the session today to answer it. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I'll just resurrect that picture I might have expressed on a couple of occasions, having an interest in history, and I'll look at a map of Europe just prior to World War II, and there you have the glorious liberal states of Europe in the sea of fascism and communism. You have Holland, and you have London, and you have France, and a few other small states, maybe, and maybe a little bit Spain, although they've become a bit decadent. But you have these shining examples of democratic liberalism. You think of the centre of these cities with their fine monuments to all the outstanding principles of the democratic liberal mind. And then you have this horror, you have Marxism rises. People don't seem to understand this, that the fascists were a reaction against Marxism. They were terrified of the Marxist takeover of their states, which was happening some places, like you had the Bavarian Soviet. You end up with fascist troopers fighting them. But you have these marvellous states in this sea of, dictatorship. You have, Holland and France and Britain. Unfortunately, Czechoslovakia as well. But what did these glorious liberal democratic states have? They had vast overseas empires of what were virtual slaves on the mass scale, supporting that splendid life of liberal democracy in the centres of their own cities. They were the good guys. These other buggers in Europe, these Germans and Poles and whatever, they're all semi-fascists or Marxists. They've gone the wrong way. We who have the huge overseas empires supporting our fine values are the good guys. But I find that a bit questionable. On the question of Medusa, saying that she was some sort of a temple official, I think the legend might be it's about somebody who's allowing their lower nature to overtake them. They're human, they're living on the borderline of a world of spiritual powers and animalistic forces, and it might be expressing that somehow Medusa is a person that's let something animalistic, the lower nature, overtake her higher nature. This isn't obviously expressed in the myth, but the serpent hair and all that is that the lower nature hasn't been kept in its place. It's overtaken the higher nature in a way. This is a common theme. This is very much expressed in, say, Goethe's Faust. He was a doctor of philosophy. He's supposed to keep away from worldly things, but he starts to desire the worldly things. He wants to become a gambler. He wants to become an entrepreneur. He wants to do all the things, chase girls, all the things philosophers of 200 or 300 years ago weren't supposed to do. They're only supposed to teach in the academies. He's been overtaken by evil passions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's what's so interesting about the Greek myths is that there's so many different versions of them. Anyone who's interested in Greek mythology, I highly recommend Robert Graves' collection of the Greek myths because he presents not just the main version of each myth, but then in short paragraphs after the main telling, he includes all the alternate versions we know about. And some of them are really different. A lot of things that we think of as settled, if we've just been exposed to a little bit of Greek mythology, you discover when you get exposed to more of it, they weren't settled at all. So, was Medusa raped and punished by Athena? Well, that was an older version of the myth, but a later version of the myth thought that that was unfair. So they changed it and said, "Oh no, she had a love affair with Poseidon. She loved Poseidon back, and they were going to have children." That's the version at the Theoi site. It says actually it was a secret affair, and so it's fairer that she's punished because she made a choice. But that's an attempt by a later age to rationalize an earlier version of the myth that they didn't think was fair. By a later age, the Greeks didn't like the idea of the gods as being these forces of nature that might be with you or might be against you. They didn't like that at all. So they changed the myths to try to make it that the people who were punished deserved to be punished because they actually did something wrong. And today, it's random if you pick up a book on Greek myths, which one of those versions you'll experience, but usually you'll only experience one of them. And then you think that's what the myth is. But then when you see the Robert Graves version, you realize all these different towns and villages had different versions of these stories, sometimes really different versions. In the oldest of the old versions, Medusa was not punished. She didn't get that way by being punished by Athena. That was a mask that the priestesses wore. And they wore it to terrify men and keep them out of the sacred precincts of the temple. This is a really old version of the myth, and so the later people don't know that version. It's so these become like a Rorschach test on which people project their expectations and their preferences. And it's what's so interesting about Robert Graves is he pulls that apart and says, no, just deal with the fact that there's 14 different versions of this. That's what there is. There isn't one true version of the myth. There's a bunch of them. And you can take from the different versions as you need, depending on what you're talking about, what you're trying to understand. Well, I mean, what Stephen just described is a perfectly legit alternate interpretation. In the earliest Greeks, snakes were a symbol of wisdom, which is why Eric Theon, the early hero of Athens before Theseus, had snakes for legs. It was a half human, half serpent, because he was wise. And the Gorgon snakes were sort of related to that. But later on, the snake lost that symbol to the Athenians, and then it became an animalistic thing, like Stephen was saying. It all depends on which version. So about going back to Douloy, there's linkages here between the Greek conceptions and the German conceptions. Hegel made it his purpose in philosophy to bring forward a bunch of ancient Greek conceptions of philosophy that he valued. As he famously says, there's not a single proposition of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus that Hegel didn't take and make a centerpiece of Hegel's own philosophy. So he's trying to line up these German terms with these Greek terms. And he has this term begriff. And begriff is a mode of thought or a kind of thought in which you think the kinds of things that Doulos thinks. A begriff is a very concrete, definite, experiential, sensory, emotive, or appetitive thought. Like when you hear a beautiful note played on a piano and you perk up, right? Or if I'm sitting here talking to you and I got my window open and a bird lands at the bird feeder and begins singing, suddenly I'm thinking about that bird. I'm like, what the heck am I listening to? You put a chocolate on your tongue and you taste it and it's got that bittersweet quality and your brain goes, ooh, how intriguing. I like this. This is a begriff, right? And it's not just the sensory itself, but also if you were working on building a building and it was a hot day and you were sweating and you remember during the day that was hot when you were sweating that you had to work around a pipe that was buried that wasn't on the blueprints. And you got to remember to tell people tomorrow, watch out for this pipe. We got to protect it. We don't know what's in it. What if it's a gas main? We have to be cautious. Part of the way that you remember it is through the concrete detail of how it felt to be hot and sweaty and your muscles exerting from when the pickaxe was going in the soil, and the moment of alarm you felt when all of a sudden you realized you almost broke open a pipe because you didn't know it was there. All of that is begriff. And so begriff, Hegel says, has this powerful quality that it can tether the mind to reality, and it tethers it through sensory details. It helps to make sure that your thinking doesn't get too far away from what's real. And it's why a doulos in an artificial society might be a hazard to the people around him. But in a natural setting, without all this infrastructure built up, living in the forest and having to remember what are the paths that lead to the poisonous mushrooms versus what are the paths that lead to the edible mushrooms. It's begriff that is giving you the memory of what it felt like the last time you walked down these paths. It's helping you to recall the difference between the poisonous and the healthy. That tethering is what's making you harmonize with your larger habitat in a way so that you don't hurt yourself or others. So begriff, Hegel says, is an incredibly important mode of thought that gets dissed too often, as though it's inferior, as though it's irrational. And Hegel's point is that irrational part of the mind is the most important part of the mind. He's not saying it's the only part that we should have, but he's saying without that, we just veer off into irreality. If we reason without begriff, then we lend ourselves to prejudices. We lend ourselves to holocausts. We lend ourselves to crusades. Abstract, other people are not real to us. They're not concrete and tangible and begriff to us. Then we start thinking that we can just make logical syllogisms and dispose of millions of people at a time with a little twist of logic. He says and this is what we're going to talk about next. The second mode of thought. If a doulos is the first character type and it's associated with a mode of thought, then the second class in Greek society, the character type that's associated with a different mode of thought is banausos. So banausos is someone who holds his appetites and feelings in contempt. He's a hyper rationalist. He's proud of how much he's learned. He's proud of how much he can reason, and he's skeptical of and contemptuous of people who are stuck in their appetites, who are parochial, who are uneducated. He embraces a mode of thought that the Greeks called noesis. And noesis is the logic, the mathematics, the learning, the education, the systematized thinking, learning to think by recipe, by algorithm, instead of by feelings and experiences. And the problem is, on the one hand, that helps to the process of rejecting and pushing away his own appetites gives him a kind of freedom the doulos will never know, because he's not as directly dependent on his appetites and experiences as the doulos is. The banausos has the possibility of escaping into the larger world of ideas and theories. And as a result of that, he can transcend the parochialism of a doulos. The doulos gives too much credence to his own experience and not enough to everybody else's. But the banausos can abstract from all of that and look at larger patterns. The banausos can have an easier time being cosmopolitan than the doulos, because the banausos understands his own experience is not the sum total of everything that matters. But the problem is that in escaping from those feelings and experiences, he gets lost in the land of theory and logic and calculations. He starts to mistake his abstractions for reality. The land of theory is very important to a banausos, and it becomes more important than reality. And so you end up with people who they want their theories to work, and they don't value reality very much. So when the data disagrees with them in science, they just cover up and hide the data that proved them wrong. And then they spotlight and emphasize the data that seems to prove them right. They put their thumb on the scale because they have a loyalty, a parochial loyalty to their theories and ideas. This is the a priorism that Kenneth Smith was talking about. The ideas, the theses, the a priori assumptions and beautiful, ideologies that the banausos subscribes to. He wants to save them and protect them and make them win, even if he has to lie to himself and others to do it. And I'm not going to put names on it like Michel Foucault. I'm not going to say he is or isn't, but we all know people like this. We've all seen people like this. There are people like this in stories all the time. And one of the classic examples of this from the Greek perspective is merchants. The merchant is guided by how much money he made. And so he needs to maximize his return on investment. And the Greeks thought merchants, you can let them out of the home and you can let them out into the world and to trade and to, they can become craftsmen, they can do carpentry, they can build things, anything that involves systems of learning and practice. But what you can't do is put them in charge of government, because then they're just going to try to win. Right? They're going to get into government and say, well, how do I make the most money? What's the biggest return on investment? Or they'll say, like utilitarianism is a classic example. They'll say, well, I think we should take this approach because, I mean, sure, it'll kill 10% of our population, but 90% will be really happy. And, 90 minus 10 is 80, and 80%, that's a B. So that's a big victory. So let's do it. They start abstracting from reality and treating concrete, tangible things as though they're just numbers on a spreadsheet or assertions in a logical syllogism. And then as a result, they treat with a complete lack of empathy situations that actually can't be resolved justly unless you're willing to risk your heart as well as your mind. And Banalsos can't do that. He's too disgusted by the earlier self that was all emotive. He doesn't want to be that person anymore. And so he just hides in his spreadsheets and theories. He says, this is, as a result, the Greeks considered this a second kind of slave. Sure, you let them out of the oikos, out of the home. They can go out into the world, but you still don't give them the vote, because you know what they'll vote for. They're going to vote to win. They're going to vote for self-interest, and they're going to think that that's a good thing. Stephen likes to talk about, the film in Wall Street in the 80s. Greed is good. Right? That whole motive of somehow an invisible hand will manipulate the market and make it so that when I screw over my competitors, somehow it's good for the world. This is the kind of reasoning a Banalsos loves. It's like I don't have to waste my time with all those weird, gross, sweaty value things and feelings. No, I can just run the numbers and do what the numbers tell me. I'm just going to be a machine, just efficient. It's very Banalsic. And the Greeks are like, so you can't let them vote. You know what they'll do with it. You know what they'll do. Why would you put them in a position of power? They're going to make sure other people lose is what they're going to do. They can't help themselves. It's how they think. He said, this is a character type. And as a result of the character type, there is a caste in the Greek world, in the political economy, that is for Banalsoi. But as Aristotle says, the beautiful land of theory in which the only people acting as Banalsoi are actual Banalsoi is unfortunately not the world we actually live in. In the world we actually live in, there are Banalsoi who are being treated like douloi, and they should be freed from the home and put out into the marketplace. And there are Banalsoi who are in our government, and they should be removed, stripped of their office, and put back into the marketplace so that they don't hurt everybody. And this is, the assertion, one of the assertions of Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War is the Peloponnesian War is what happens when Athens gives the vote to the Banalsoi. Then the Banalsoi are like, okay, yeah, we might destroy the entire Mediterranean world, but think how rich we could get if we could conquer Sicily. I mean, we could control all the trade in the Mediterranean. Wouldn't that be great? Let's build the biggest fleet the world has ever seen and sail off to Sicily and never sail back, because we're all going to die in a war that was completely unnecessary and stupid. Because at the exact same time, we were already fighting a war with Sparta. What are we doing opening up another front with a whole other part of the Mediterranean? Well, look at the money. If you're a Banalsos, you're like, if we win this, we're going to be so rich. We have to do it. The money's too good. Can't help ourselves. And Thucydides is like, that's what happens when you put Banalsoi in charge of government. You wreck everything. So, yeah, as Stephen says, it was only stupid because they lost. This is exactly Banalsic reasoning. The Banalsic reasoning is, if we'd won, it would have been smart. It's not our fault it lost, Of course, we should take the giant risk and destroy everything, because it could have been cool. This is very central. Okay, so Banalsos. So Hegel calls the kind of thought a Banalsos focuses on Verstand. Verstand. And a Verstand is the opposite of a Begriff. It's not experiential at all. It's very abstract. It's not based on experience. It's based on education. What have I been taught to think? What have I learned? How have I learned to reason about this situation? Computer programming is a very Banausic experience involving a lot of Verstand. We get training. It is most Verstand if you separate testing from programming. If programmers are allowed to write software without ever being held accountable for if it breaks, they veer into Verstand, the land of theory. And they're like, well, it seems like this should work, so I'm going to write it this way, and I'm going to send it off. And if it doesn't, I don't care. That's somebody else's problem. Woo, I win. This is a Verstand mode of programming. Whole-minded programming is when you make the programmers responsible for the bugs. And now, if they had a brilliant idea and they send it into the world and it fails, guess what? They have to fix it. And so now you get the feedback loop of reality beating up their beautiful theories and forcing them to change their minds and grow up and learn, how do I have to write software that isn't going to make this rocket crash or isn't going to result in my accidentally overdosing this patient? This is the feedback loop that's missing from Verstand. Verstand, when the programmers don't have to test their software, debug their software, and not held accountable for their software, they can just veer further and further into whatever the latest theory is they learned in school. Ooh, my theory is object orientation. I'm going to make everything objects. Oh yeah, well, my theory is relational programming. Everything is going to be relational tables. Oh yeah, well, my theory, and they all have a theory. And they apply their theory to the hilt, regardless of whether it applies to the current situation, because reality is not part of the picture. The only thing that's part of the picture is, did you satisfy the algorithm? Did you follow the logical syllogism? Do you have the degree? Do you have the meritocracy, piece of paper that says I'm allowed to do the following things? Are you with it? Are you hip? Are you doing all the bits? And so he says the problem is, on the one hand, it gets out of the parochial trap. You're able to think widely. Theories are often theories of everything. It's like, if someone is a bigot and they're thinking all black people are like this, well, this is great. They no longer have to meet, hundreds of millions of black people one by one and try to figure out who each one is. They can just make a declaration, and suddenly they've disposed of, a whole continent full of people and other people around the world. There's an exhilarating, intoxicating quality to being able to abstract on such a wide, universalizing scale. And it can be positive. You could come up with E equals MC squared, which applies to literally every object anywhere in the cosmos, right? That's as universal as you could get, just about, and yet doesn't seem to contain a lot of bigotry. So we're not saying it's only bigotry, but we're saying this broad sweeping gestures thing is, on the one hand, it gets you out of the parochial trap, but on the other hand, it gets you into the new trap. And the new trap is, well, how do you know your idea is any good? And the Verstand reflex is, don't talk to me about such things. La 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 la. You either agree with me or you disagree with me, or we can have a big debate about it, and I think I can beat you in an intellectual argument, which means I win. And I go about carrying out my intellectual ideas. Hegel says, to abstract, Hegel is blunt about this. He's, on the one hand, if we didn't have Verstand, we'd all just be animals in the forest, right? It's Verstand that allows us to notice patterns and predict the future. So on the one hand, it's incredibly important. But on the other hand, because it detaches from reality and moves us into the land of theory, he says, to abstract is to be in error. Verstand, it inherently carries with it errors. And the more widely we reason, the farther we go from the evidence, the bigger the errors become. So, Verstand is the sort of thing that leads to people making nuclear bombs and dropping them on countries. So they're like, what? They're just numbers. The question is, can I force Japan to surrender? Look at the numbers. Look at the power. E equals MC squared. Look at the calculations. Everything becomes, abstracted. So the Greeks wouldn't let those people vote, and they set up castes. And that leads us to the last category, which is the aristos. And an aristos is someone who neither lets his naive gnosis be his master, not just experiences and feelings, but also he won't let his naive noesis be his master, not just logic and theories and education. Neither of those things should be the master. And we know by looking at Doulos and Benausos and saying, oh my God, did you see what that Doulos did? Oh my God, did you see what that Benausos did? We don't want to be those people. So we're not going to give our allegiance to either faculty of the brain. We're going to make them serve us. And we're going to do that by pitting them against each other. Every time Verstand has a beautiful theory, we're going to go collect a bunch of experience and beat up the beautiful theory with the data. See if the theory holds up, right? This is Karl Popper's theory of falsification, which he says is the basis of science. You try to disprove your theory. You don't hide the bad evidence. You collect all the bad evidence and you use it to beat your theory over the head with. And only if your theory survives do you reluctantly publish a paper and say, I don't know, I guess it might be true. I did 75 things to try to disprove it and I haven't succeeded yet. I hope you can disprove it. But in the meantime, it's the best theory I've got. That's science. Not this is my precious, precious, beautiful theory, and you should all believe it. And if you don't believe it, I'll punch you in the face because I need to win. That's Verstand. So an Aristos doesn't want to be ruled by either faculty of the brain. He doesn't want to be a slave. And that means he has to pit these things against each other. It means doubt. He can't be sure of himself because of how he feels, and he can't be sure of himself because of his ideology. In fact, if he detects an ideology in himself, the only thing he's sure about is that that's bullshit. All ideologies are bullshit. And if he has a strong parochial set of feelings about that, he's skeptical about that too. He's constantly, our friend Phil would say, he's equivocating between these modes of thought, constantly trying to test, constantly skeptical of himself, wondering where he's got it wrong, because he knows he's got it wrong somewhere. The question is where. And other people's values matter as much to him as his values do, because he knows his values are imperfect as well. So he's always searching for the truth, always trying to do better. And this is why the Greeks said only Aristoi should have the vote, because they're the only ones who aren't sure of themselves. They're the only ones who take the real world seriously, right? Because Banausoi don't. And they're the only ones who take theories and patterns in education seriously, as well as experience, right? Because the douloi don't take those things seriously. They only take their experience seriously. The mode of thought associated with Aristoi is Vernunft. Vernunft. And that, says Hegel, is what Homo sapiens evolved to grow up into. Because we are designed to be born in an experience of intense begriff. I mean, an infant is a live wire of experience. And then what we should do is gradually transform ourselves to negate that and pull ourselves into educating ourselves with Verstand. But too many people stop there and declare themselves done. He says, but that's just another half-witted mode. What we have to do is then negate the Verstand, use the begriff that we cast away to critique the Verstand and pull ourselves out into the grown-up mode of mind, Vernunft, in which we're skeptical about both of those. So all of this goes to what Kenneth is talking about here. What Sharon asked about, and I'm going to read that passage again. And imagine in brackets the word medieval. Medieval Christian fideism, right, religion by faith, is a degradation of Platonic a priorism, that's Verstand, into irrationalism. He's saying that Platonic a priorism, because Plato's at Aristos, is balanced more. It includes more begriff. Because he's in Aristos, there's begriff and Verstand involved in the way that Plato uses a priori reasoning. But once you degrade that into just a kind of faith, then now you're down to just premises that you're not allowed to question. And now you've lost that questioning scientific side that begriff supplies to Vernunft. And you're reduced to Verstand, which is too sure of itself and lives in the land of theory. And then he finishes the sentence, the evolutionarily or rationally retrograde collapse. And by that, he means the degradation he was just talking about. A philosophical culture, by which he means Aristeia, into dogmatism, by which he means Banauseia. He's saying we've moved from a realm in which you can have premises, but you have to check them and question them, which is what an Aristos would do, which is what Plato would do. And we've reduced that to a bunch of premises you're never allowed to question, which is dogmatism, which is how a Banausos reasons. The Banausos, the merchant can't question his idea that all value can be represented by money. He can't question it. He can question anything else, but he's got his one premise he won't give up on. It's a faith with him. It's a fideism. It's a dogmatism. It's Verstand, the characteristic of a Banausos. So this is what he's trying to talk about in sentence 2. He's saying that when the early proto-medieval writers were evaluating the Greek philosophers, they saw in Plato not just what Plato said, but what they could bend him into that would be more comfortable for them than what Plato actually said. So they did that. Now, people who study the relationship between Greek myths and medieval philosophy, are well aware that the one, if you had to pick one name and say who's most responsible for injecting a lot of Platonism, warped Platonism into medieval theology, it's Augustine, St. Augustine, who wrote City of God. He explicitly does it. He explicitly evokes Plato and talks about him and shows how you can rework Plato to justify the theology that had emerged by the time Augustine was writing. So when he's saying there's a degradation that's happening, a collapse out of a philosophical culture into a kind of dogmatism, what he's really saying here is Augustine did this. And everybody embraced it because they said, that's just what we needed. We needed a strong pseudo-philosophical underpinning for the dogmatism that we now want to be the centerpiece of our new genocidal religious empire. We need people not to question, and we think we can bend Plato into an excuse for that. Of course, Plato would not have been pleased. But Plato loved a good dialogue. He loved a good debate. That's why he wrote dialogues. The whole point is to pit ideas against each other, not to say this is the one true idea and the rest of you get a punch in the face. So Plato would not have approved, but they did it without his permission. All right, Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, of course, today we have a technical class who practice a technical culture, and they've gone to college and all that sort of nonsense and taught a certain outlook on the world. And they believe that they are the ones that can lead because they have the technical voodoo magic before. That's beyond the world of Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, they object to, and they try to say, well, they don't matter. Now, this is something I get in with our local rationalists, as I call them. They ignore the fact that there's a vast, well, probably majority of the population who very successfully operate on their gnosis, their gut instincts. But this intellectual class keeps on trying to say, well, we're the real deal. We can just ignore them. They don't matter. We're the enlightened ones. But this suggests that there's something misleading in this belief, that to be a real understanding is something beyond what this technical class is conceiving of a cold, impersonal ideology. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Personal ideology, yes, a recurring theme. We'll talk about that a lot today, and probably for the rest of the time we do these seminars. So there's a question David passed along from the live stream saying, so it's a kind of Greek noblesse oblige, and yeah, see, Aristeia, the upper class in the Greek world, was intended as a kind of Greek noblesse oblige. But it's a little different in that the noblesse oblige we associate with feudalism and medievalism is associated with the idea of being a virtuous person, and virtuous in the medieval sense of being a good person, someone who lived a good life and did good things in the world. And the idea was that regardless of what your economic or political interests are, you should sacrifice for the greater good. You should take care of the poor, not because it would hurt you if you didn't take care of the poor, but because a good person would take care of the poor. So if you have more privilege, you should wield part of it to take care of the poor. That's what Jesus would want you to do. That's the concept of noblesse oblige as transferred through, the Arthurian medieval kind of romances. So you could think of it as a kind of Greek noblesse oblige, but the Greeks saw it a lot pointier than that. They believed it's about it's about survival. If you let Duloi and Banalsoi be in charge, they're going to wreck everything. They're just going to line their own pockets. They're going to, use their power to rape children. They're going to use their, to rip off everybody around them. They'll wreck the country for their own benefit. And in the case of Duloi, it will be for their experiential benefit, how it makes them feel. And if they're Banalsoi, it'll be for their ideological benefit. How does it add up on the spreadsheets? How does it satisfy my theories? When, as Stephen talks about Pol Pot and the extermination of the intellectual class that happened under his regime, it was a classic example of counter pragmatism. I mean, they wrecked their own economy by killing off everyone who had an education, and they didn't do it because they benefited in some practical, tangible way. They did it because they had a theory. And their theory was that the educated class had fucked everything up. So now they were going to get rid of the educated class. So everybody they could find who was educated, they murdered them. And thus we get the killing fields. This is an example where a theory, not practical concerns the way we think about it, but an ideology is driving enormous changes in a nation. And the Greeks said that's what happens if you let Banalsoi get in charge. They will use their theories without any regard to the reality that those theories are trampling, and without any regard to the survival. So to the Greeks, Aristoi taking into account the needs of other people isn't a matter of sacrificing their own needs because God wants them to be good. That's what noblesse oblige means as it comes down to us. It was, if we let those people be in charge, they will ruin us. They will ruin everything. They'll ruin each other. They'll ruin themselves. They don't know how not to do that. Duloi have one kind of half-wittedness, but also have a different kind of half-wittedness. And even if you put both wits together and pit them against each other and do your very best to be a coherent, sane human being who makes good governing choices, we're still going to get it wrong a bunch of the time because we're mortals. We don't understand most of the things we need to understand. It is the nature of a human being to err. So even an Aristos is going to screw up. They're not any kind of Ubermensch, right? But at least they're trying, which the Duloi and Banalsoi are decidedly not trying. The Duloi and Banalsoi are cocksure of themselves. Only the Aristoi are like, I know I'm going to screw this up, but let's see what I can do to minimize my screw ups. What is for the best of this kingdom so we don't all go down under the waters? It's not just a matter of, I should be a good person and be nice to other people. It's, our survival is at stake. The Greeks saw governance by Aristoi as a matter of existentialist survival. And that makes it different from noblesse oblige. It's not the medieval concept. It has some surface similarities, but the motivation is radically different. Aristotle, and you'll notice as we talk about Duloi, Banalsoi, and Aristoi, we're coming back to Aristotle over and over because he was a critic of Greek politics in a big way, in a way that moderns usually miss. He would describe how things are supposed to be and not tell you, by the way, none of the city states are actually doing this because they're all a bunch of buttheads. He wouldn't say that part. He'd just say, these are our ideals that we all swore to, because he knows his audience is looking around their own governments going, and yet we're not following them, are we? I mean, look at who we've got in charge. This is obviously we're falling short. Half of the discussion is supposed to be taking place in the heads of the audience. We're not that audience, so we miss half the point. So his point in spelling all these things out is to say, man, are the Greeks messing up. Remember, he's writing after the Peloponnesian War. He's writing after Philip has conquered Greece. He's writing at a time when he's trying to tutor Alexander in how to rule the Greeks, because the Greeks are dead. They're gone. They're over with. We've been defeated. We're not independent anymore. We're now subject under the Macedonians. So he's writing from a position of looking backward and critiquing what went wrong. And as he points out, when it comes to Aristeia, I mean, the theory might be that the people in charge are supposed to be like we just described. But if we actually look around, what are all these Duloi and Banalsoi doing up in the upper echelons of our societies? Why are they all on our ruling councils? Didn't we say that wasn't supposed to happen? He's emphasizing the breach between theory and reality. and saying half of the reason that we lost our independence to the Macedonians is because we kept telling ourselves we had all these wonderful checks and balances, and that the aristoi, the people occupying the roles of aristoi in our society, we would just tell ourselves that if they were in that role, they must actually have aristic character. And yet, when we look at the ways they behave, we see a whole shit ton of douloi and banausoi, don't we? Not nearly enough aristoi. So he's critiquing. He's saying that we have to think clearly about the difference between the way we want things to be and what a mess we have actually made instead. And this is one of the ways in which, as Donald says, you want to read Nicomachean Ethics, you want to see what he has to say about slavery, and you have to understand that he's doing it from the perspective of there are some real issues in human character, and people should make societies that respect those issues, but we have failed to do that. Even though we said that we were going to do it, we failed. And that's why we lost. I don't know if it's a myth that Aristotle is Alexander's tutor. That's what I've always heard. So, yes, too often, those occupying the political economic class of aristoi, who were called aristoi, were upon closer examination actually douloi and banausoi. And I'll just drop that in the chat for the record. So all of this is being evoked by Kenneth in these sentences when he's talking about a retrograde collapse from a philosophical culture into dogmatism. The philosophical culture is the eristic culture. To be an aristos, to pit your gnosis against your noesis, your Verstand against your Begriff, to try to achieve some higher loyalty to reality, is ultimately a philosophical thing to do. It's, to the Greeks, that's the heart of philosophy. It is not being wise, it's being a lover of wisdom. It's being able to sacrifice for wisdom, looking for some way to get out of the trap of our two half-witted modes. And he's saying, the problem is that it's when somebody who is banausic looks at somebody who is eristic, they can't see the difference in terms of something good. All they see is, wow, you're like only a halfway effective banausos. If you would just discipline yourself with these spreadsheets in the market and my theories, you could be really effective. That's what a banausos thinks when they look at an aristos. Every time an aristos deviates from what a banausos would have done, every time they take into account reality, other people and whether they matter, things like that, the banausos says, wow, you really made a mistake there. You could have made so much more money. You could have had so much more power. You could have been so much truer to this theory, but instead, I don't know. I like where you're heading, but here, hand me the reins and I'll make this thing really go. And that's how you collapse into dogmatism, is when people, they have the flatland of the banausic mind misunderstands what it's seeing in an aristos. So it has taken us a while. That's 2 hours, but Sharon, that's the answer to your question. This is the gist of what Kenneth's getting at here with these. This is what these clauses are doing together in this sentence. And ultimately, he could have written an entire chapter out of what he tried to stuff into sentence 2 there. And when we say that Kenneth is a dense, chewy writer, this is exactly what we mean. He's kind of in a hurry here, and he's using some shorthand that is loaded with meaning to him, but it takes a lot of work on the reader's part to unpack all the things that he's crammed in there. And there's an enormous amount of Heraclitus in there. There's an enormous amount of Aristotle and Plato in there. St. Augustine, you name it. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, a huge amount of stuff. All right, are we ready to move on from sentence 2? Shall we draw sentence 3? Paragraph 5, sentence 3. It embraces, as if it were the most complete virtue, the vice of somnambulism, going through life in a dream state. And he's referring here to that. He's talking about fideism. This harks. Remember that the title of this chapter is Faith Understood as a Vice, right? Faith Understood as a Vice is chapter 9. the section on medieval civilization. And so the question is, is faith always a good thing, or are there conditions in which it's dangerous? And part of what he's talking about here is the ways in which it's possible to have enormous faith in your own ideas, faith in your own certainty, your rectitude, self-righteousness, faith in your own theories and ideologies in a way that is hyper-destructive to the health and sanity of yourself and everybody around you. I mean, this weekend I read an article about a psychiatrist. He was in charge of a number of patients, and he was trying to he saw an experiment in which two people both thought they were the same historical figure, and one of them met the other one and was shocked out of her delusion and went on to live a healthy life, got released, and became a productive member of society. You can't both be Joan of Arc, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not Joan of Arc. Maybe the other person is Joan of Arc. And he said, that's amazing. I've got 3 people who think they're Jesus. So I'm going to run an experiment in which I'm going to see if I put those 3 people in a room together and make them encounter each other, can I shake them loose, at least one of them, maybe loose of their delusion? And it didn't work. He wrote a whole paper about this. It didn't work at all. They all doubled down. They became more convinced. 2 of them became more convinced they were Jesus, and the third one became convinced he was somebody else entirely, which was even crazy. The thing he thought he was even crazier. And not one of them escaped the trap. And he said it wasn't until decades later that he realized there weren't 3 deluded people in that room. There were 4 deluded people, because he had the delusion that he could control other people's delusions and he could manipulate them and make them do what he thought was therapeutically right. But he didn't have that power. And it took him spectacularly failing in public in order to get jarred loose from his delusion. So we're talking about faith as a vice. And in that context, he's saying the problem with fideism is that going through life in a dream state in which you protect yourself from evidence to the contrary of your beliefs, whether they're appetite of experiential, parochial, concrete realities, but very limited ones, or whether they're broad sweeping generalizations completely detached from reality. The vices, the vice on the one hand of a doulos, or the vice on the other hand of a benausos. Either way, those people are going through life in a dream state. And you remember anyone knows what it feels like when you're dreaming. Sometimes you have very strong ideas about what I have to get to this room to say something to this person. They need to hear what I have to say. And in this dream, you'll have all these obstacles coming up, and you go to the stairs, and suddenly it's not the stairs at your house. Instead, it's the stairs at your high school from your childhood. And you're like, what am I doing here? Well, I guess the room must still be up there. So you start going up the stairs of your high school, and next thing you turn a corner and now you're somewhere else, and some other drama comes up. And that feeling of immersion and of certainty about you got to go do this thing. And I don't know why everything's being so confusing, but I have to push through it. This is the life, in some sense, of a doulos or a benausos. Because the problem with their half-witted modes of life is that they can't reflect reality very well. The doulos can only reflect the small piece of reality that he's part of, he's directly experienced, and he overestimates its importance. The benausos isn't reflecting any part of reality. He's off in the land of theory. And he might be describing real patterns in the world, or he might be completely lost in fake ideological patterns that he insists on imposing interpretively on everything he encounters. And either way, they're missing what's really going on. This issue of virtue and vice is highly relevant here. Virtue is from the Roman, the Latin, virtu, which means, God help us, it means manliness. Right? Because, of course, you wouldn't want to be like a woman. If you're a Roman patriarch who's misogynist to the core, the worst thing you could think of is womanishness. And so virtue, the word that means to have a virtue, means to be like a man. God bless the Romans. To the Greeks, who are more relevant to this discussion at the moment, they didn't have the word virtue. They had the word arete. And because we inherit our English language through an enormous amount of Latin, our virtue is very close to the Roman virtue, just sort of translated through medieval ideas about being good because God says so, or because you want to be a good person. It's kind of watering down the whole who's the manliest man of the original Romans. But the Greek arete, it has to do with the pursuit of excellence that's needed for the survival of your species, for the survival of your way of life, to thrive in it. And it's a much richer and more complex idea than virtue. And Kenneth knows that. He's evoking all of this right here when he's talking about this. So when he says that somnambulism is a vice that is being embraced as though it were a complete virtue, that anybody who knows Kenneth well recognizes that this is an allusion. This is an allusion to Heraclitus, because Heraclitus is the earliest person we know who makes very strong judgmental statements about not wanting to live your life as though you're asleep. And Kenneth, although he never published it, and I don't think he ever finished it, he started a whole series of books about Heraclitus. Heraclitus is a favorite influence of his, not just directly, but also because of, so is Hegel, and Hegel says that Heraclitus is a big influence on Hegel. So Kenneth was doubly inclined to immerse himself in Heraclitus. So I happen to have a few Heraclitus fragments that I think will be helpful here. All of this is from Wheelwright's translations. And I'll just go through them quickly. And we'll see that and what I think you'll see is that all of this is relevant. For those of you who haven't been on a lot of these calls, the way that Kenneth writes is before he writes, he first collects a bunch of quotes, pithy quotes that are on the subject, that are powerful. And then he thinks about the relationships among the quotes and what it is that he might want to say. And then he works his text through it. And sometimes he decides to quote the quote and actually stick it into the text. And other times he discards the quote since it's already served its function for him. So when we see a reference to somnambulism and going through life in a dream state, you know that he had Heraclitus quotes in hand. And he just decided not to actually explicitly cite them. They'd be distractions from the flow of the argument. But they are what he was thinking about. So it's helpful to go see what those fragments were. So this is the first one. This is widely considered to be the opening of Heraclitus' scroll. Several different commentators from the ancient world say this is how the scroll opened. Although this logos, and he's talking about the laws of nature, the deep patterns and principles of nature, although this logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it. Not only before hearing it, which Heraclitus is asserting, of course you can't understand it if you never even heard of it, but even after they've heard it for the first time. And people hear that this thing is out there, that there are these deep principles of nature, and then they just disregard them. Heraclitus continues, that is to say, although all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, right? The laws of nature control everything. Men seem to be quite without any experience of it, at least if they're judged in the light of such words and deeds as I'm here setting forth. My own method, Heraclitus' own method, is to distinguish each thing according to its nature. That phrase is kataphusin, and Aristotle uses that phrase, according to nature, kataphusin, over and over and over and over. It's central to the ancient worldview. My own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature and to specify how it behaves. What does it actually do? Not what does it claim to do, but what does it actually do? Other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. He's accused Heraclitus in the very opening of his scroll is accusing most men of being sleepwalkers, somnambulists, of going through life in a dream state. He couldn't be clearer about it. And people may say, people may remember things like you can't step in the same river twice, or everything is made out of fire, or, expect the unexpected, blah, blah, blah. But none of that is here. This is the opening. He starts with this problem. He says human being sleepwalking is a massive problem because the laws of nature are all around them, and they behave as though they have no idea that nature has any laws. And it causes catastrophe for human beings. Kataphusin, right? According to nature. Remember that Aristotle says man by nature is a political animal. Man by nature desires to know. Aristotle, as a classic Greek philosopher, is concerned about the character of things, the nature of things. What are they most essentially inside? What is driving them? Why do they do the things that they do? What are their yearnings? What do they notice and not notice? What do they want and what do they avoid? Yeah, and if you don't understand the character of something, then you're constantly going to be surprised when it does something you didn't expect. That's why he talks about behavior, specify how it behaves. According to its nature, its character, its ethos, and to specify how it behaves. That is, its behavior derives from its character. So by studying its behavior, studying its character, and studying the relationship between the two, you can map out how something's inner nature drives how that thing expresses itself in the larger world of the nature around it. The nature within us is our ethos or character, and the nature around us is the realm in which we behave. So all of this stuff is more tightly related than it seems at first. And when he says that people are going around in a dream state, he's saying that they're heedless of what's going on around them, the nature around them. They're heedless of what's going on within them, which means they don't know themselves. Genothi seauton, know yourself. They don't know themselves. They don't know their own character. And the things they do are not helpful for themselves or others. It's what it means to go through life in a dream state. It means you walk out into traffic and get killed. It means you walk off a cliff and fall to your death. It means you walk into a minefield and get blown up. To go through life in a dream state is to live a painful life and a shorter life than it has to be. Ginny, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
When I'm in your meeting like this, I'm thinking, oh my God, Greeks were such an enlightened people. And then I go to another meeting here and there, and I go, oh, maybe not. Maybe they here and there. I was in a meeting and they said, oh, they even ate each other or something. What's that word? Not carnivores, but anyway. So, but based on your meeting here, for example, what percentage of Greeks were they just some of the aristocrats who were so enlightened and so evolved, or I'm just curious, Rick.
Well, Kenneth says that Aristotle says that about a third of the people in Athens were Aristoi, and about a third were Benousoi, and about a third were Douloi. I don't know if Aristotle's assessment is correct, but I do know that he was in a position to see and I'm not. So, whatever estimate I could give could only be less accurate than Aristotle's assessment. And Aristotle thought that other city states, the proportion was worse. He says in Sparta, by design, very few people were Aristoi, and a very large number of people were Douloi and Benousoi. But about the
not using your terminology, Aristoi, Douloi, I'm still like, yeah. All this vocabulary, I'm just always so amazed.
It's a struggle, right? But we use it because there's just no equivalent English terms. I mean, any English word I could use instead of those three words would just be confusing. I try not to gratuitously Greek at everybody.
No, I love it. It's like going to a class and learn all these new words, and it's fabulous, Rick. I love it. Yeah.
Thank you. Glad you're enjoying it. So let's turn to fragment 16. We have a series of fragments from Heraclitus that all bear on this question of going through a life in a dream state and what does it mean. He has this somewhat mysterious fragment 16. This numbering, by the way, this is the number that Wheelwright uses in his 1959 translation called Heraclitus. Whatever we see when awake is death, when asleep dreams. Now, taken on its own, this fragment makes you just scratch your head and go, what? What? And for about 20 years, my reaction to this was, what's Heraclitus talking about? And I think the key to understanding it is to put it after fragment 1, because he's saying sleepwalking is dangerous, right? It's to be separated from reality, to not be connected to what's happening around and within you, is to be in a state of danger in which your actions can be non-harmonized with reality. A mouse who's snoozing while the elephants are fighting is a mouse that's going to get squished. You have to be attending to the important things that are happening around you, or you're doomed. So, but why would he say, whatever we see when awake is death? That's an odd thing to say. And every commentator I've ever read, I've got 3 shelves of translations of Heraclitus. He's my favorite philosopher. They are all baffled by this. Everybody gives a different explanation for the first part. The second part seems obvious to them. They're like, well, of course, when you're asleep, what you see is dreams. You're not seeing reality. But that first part, they're like, well, why would you be seeing death? What the hell? And I think the key is, first of all, that you tie the second part not to being self-explanatory, but you tie it back to his concern that to walk through life is dangerous. And it is to be avoided at all costs. And if that's true, then being awake is the better state to be in. Because now you can be connected to reality. And he's saying that when you're connected to reality, what we see is death. Why would we see death? Well, we'd see death because we're mortals. The Greeks and I can't believe it took me so long to figure this out. The Greeks were very concerned about human mortality. And by mortality, of course, they didn't just mean that we die. They also meant that our creative works die. And of course, the third thing, which they said is far worse than the first 2 things, is that we're so stupid. The Greeks thought Homo sapiens is a deeply stupid species. They say the oak knows what the hell to do, right? I can't remember who it is, the playwright who says, except for the first 9 months of his life, no man manages his affairs half so well as a tree does. And it's right on, right? The tree mostly does the right thing. People are lucky when they do the right thing. Mostly we're flailing about wandering into traffic, wondering why we got hit by a car. And, we pride ourselves on the number of times we get things right and say, this means that we're just brilliant. But then look around at the world we're making and the stupid wars we're fighting and the dumpster fire we're making of our economy. And it's like, does this all look like people who are, smart and with it? This is a species that gets easily confused. You'll never see a cheetah mismanage its affairs as badly as most people mismanage their affairs. So the Greeks thought that Homo sapiens was a pretty stupid species, and that if we were going to try to survive, we're going to have to work very, very, very hard to compensate for that. And so part of compensating for it is recognizing that we have a problem. Man is mortal. Now, that syllogism that's used to explain what a logical syllogism is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, ergo Socrates is mortal. And I'll go, oh yeah, okay, so that's a logical syllogism. And the Greeks are like, no, you idiot. We're mortal. Don't look away from it. Pay attention to it. Be skeptical of your intelligence. Understand the limits. Have some humility. Understand the limits of, don't be certain about things. Gods can be certain about things because they got the whole picture. We should not be certain about things. We're missing most of the picture. I mean, even if you just look at which part of the electromagnetic spectrum is visible to us, it's a sliver in the middle. We're missing all the radio signals and the gamma radiation, the cosmic rays. We can't see the infrared. We can't see the ultraviolet. We look at a starling and think it's a black bird. And you look at under ultraviolet and it's like a peacock. It's just a riot of color, but we can't see the color. It's just right over our heads. We're missing most of the picture. And so we need to stay focused on the fact that we're missing most of the picture. And the Greeks also say part of the reason we're stupid is we're not around long enough. These other animals have instincts to point them in the right direction 9 times out of 10, but we miss most of our instincts. Evolution played a trick on us and got rid of them. So we're having to try to figure things out that other animals would not have to try to figure out at all. The horse goes to water. And the human wanders around in the desert going, what the hell? So whatever we see when awake is death, I think is meant to say, first of all, that there are real dangers around us that we need to be aware of and cautious about. This is the fundamental proposition of Greek polytheism, that we need to study the most important parts of nature and figure out when to get out of the way so the elephant doesn't step on us. If we don't do that, we're dead. And of course, the other half of it is what we see when awake is death is because as mortals, our perspective is limited to the mortal perspective, the perspective of someone who's born to die. But that's still better than being completely detached from reality and being, as he says, unaware of what's going on around and within us, which would be the state that we're in when we're sleepwalking through life. So I think that fragment 16 makes the most sense when you put it together with fragment 1. It really isn't mysterious at all. It's coherent. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I've had some little differences with one of our local philosophers about the dream states. Now, this is getting back to the zero-dimensional thinking. They tend to believe dreaming is something you do when you're not awake. You know, when you're not awake, you enter this movie theater called a dream. But I think I've noticed falling asleep in front of Zoom sessions that the dreaming state is always there. It's always in operation. It's a level of consciousness, and it's our waking consciousness that's built on top of the dream state. Unless that dreaming level of mind was there, we probably couldn't operate. But they think, oh, no, it's you have a waking, you're in the waking state movie theater, and now you're in the dream state movie theater, which is partly true in terms of your attention. But this faculty of dreaming mind is always at work. That's my conclusion. But, you know, the local philosophers who are such terribly smart people will reject this. And I think that's the danger of intellect and having too high an IQ is a risk. Because if you have a lower IQ, when you're working with the concepts, you have to tackle them a lot harder. If your IQ is too good, you'll just brush past things too easily. And you'll miss a certain discernment. This is the thing, yeah, those intellectuals, higher IQ, the better you are. True, the better you are at certain things, like being a librarian, and you'll be a more efficient librarian. And yes, it increases certain types of efficiencies. It comes at a price. Goethe famously, his point that when we generalize, it's wonderful. We can speed past everything. I don't just come to a tree and see everything is there because I'll be stuck there forever. I can generalize and say, oh, that's just a tree, and off I go to the next tree. Generalization is like a huge net with huge openings that you cast into the sea, and it captures a big fish and the small fish go through it. This is the thing, people with a lower IQ, even though they haven't got such a huge picture, are the ones that can capture the small fish, which the people with the higher IQ have failed to notice. So this zero-dimensional thinking, it's all one way. No, it's your extension in a certain direction has a price to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hegel would be so proud of you right now. Yes, these are some of Hegel's core arguments that the hyper-intellectual thinks that his education and intellect means that he's right more often. But that's why Hegel says over and over, to abstract is to be in error. What's familiar to us is for that reason not recognized for what it truly is. But Duloi might be slavish by temperament, by character, but their primary mode of thought is begriff, and begriff tethers them to reality in a way that ensures there is an enormous amount of reality in the things that they're thinking. You know, it's like you say, you know, it's you fly over the forest, it's just like, okay, it's a bunch of trees. But you actually go into the forest and have to walk it on your feet uphill. And you start to notice, even when they're the same species, no two trees are the same. And the differences are not small. I mean, they're gigantic. One tree might be sitting on a bunch of boulders with its roots reaching around the boulder to try to get to the soil at the edges. And you look at it and you're like, That thing is massive, and somehow it's teetering on these rocks. How did it not fall over? And frequently, the conclusion you reach is, I have no earthly idea why that tree is upright, but it's older than this country, so it's doing something right. And then you'll go further along, and there's another tree that's just, you say, okay, it's dead on the ground, it's fallen over. But it's a big old rotting tree, and there's 14 tiny trees that are sprouting on top of it and growing out of it. And that means that the root system of the old dead tree is somehow still alive and supplying nutrients to all these trees that are growing out of it. And you're like, is it alive or is it dead? These are called nursery trees. They're all over the Pacific Northwest because it's so wet and rainy. And these are the things we miss when we fly overhead at an abstract level. We say, 1 + 1 is 2. One tree plus one tree equals two trees. They're all the same. But you actually get into the world and you discover, no, none of them are the same. Okay, do I have one apple or two apples if one of them is completely rotten? How many apples do I really have? Well, math says you've got two, but I'm not going to be eating two apples. I can tell you that much. These differences that are being abstracted away from in the realm of the intellect, these are the differences that matter. Harvey Manning of the Mountaineers Club, they did hiking all up and down the Pacific Northwest, and they published books and wrote essays. He famously said, to increase your world, slow your pace. He made me think of that. It's like as we drive through, it seems like a small area, but if we get out of the car and start walking, we realize how big it is and how much is going on there that we were just missing as a blur in our window as we drove past. Donna, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so I'll try to language this. But when we're talking about the dream state, and that, I guess I'll call it a default. It just reminded me of some of the reading that I've been doing lately about the neuroscience. And I didn't read Thinking Slow and Thinking Fast, but I guess it's about this as well. But I did read David Eagleman, Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain. And basically he says, he put it in a nutshell, he goes, the brain runs its show incognito. And the unconscious precedes and dominates, our consciousness. We just get a summary and we just get, tangible things to manage, direct our lives, navigate. So there's so much more going on unconscious, which has, I think, can be, language as akin to a dream state. But also I found it interesting, I think it was Eagleman that said this too, that I'm pretty sure, that he believes that dreaming is actually the mind's constant state of survival, and the mind does not turn its survivalistic processes off at night. That is what is still going on when we take our sensory perceiving out of it. And so that, to me, once again, points to a default state that is always at play for our survival. And I feel like could be called the dream state that we're talking about now, that people are in until they, quote unquote, wake up. And then I also think of some of the Toltec tribes who talk about, indigenous tribes who talk about the dream state and how that's how we function.
That's great stuff, Donna. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Heraclitus is using a metaphor here, and so's Kenneth, in which they're comparing being trapped in ideology or in the experiential life as a dream state. But the Greeks actually thought that real dream states, when you're actually asleep, were important. And even though Heraclitus is sort of making these equations, the truth is that the Greeks would have thought the kind of dreams that you're talking about, what are you actually doing when you're dreaming? It is some kind of, it's not nonsense. There's some kind of deeper truths of your unconscious that are being explored there. I mean, they thought you were sort of in the realm of Dionysus, and learning about your own inner nature. And certainly the indigenous tribes I've read about think similarly, that the dreams you have, the dream state you're in when you're literally dreaming is a very important source of information and sometimes wisdom. The kind of dream state that Heraclitus is talking about here is where people mistake being conscious for being connected to reality. And so he's using a metaphor. And this is, oh yeah, George Bernard Shaw. Thank you, Donald. That was the source of the quote about men not managing their lives as well as a tree do. Very good. So it's, if Heraclitus had access to the modern science, I think what he would say is the kind of dream state that a doulos or a benausos is in is a lot less useful than the dream state we're in when we're asleep. The dream state we're in when we're asleep has some real merit to it to learn about ourselves. But the dream state we're in when we're captured by an ideology is more like a kind of a abstract nightmare disconnected from reality, in which we're exploring the consequences of this irreal set of assumptions that's baked into the ideology as though that were the real world. Or likewise, when a parochial person is trying to reduce the whole world to fit within the life that they've had so far, it's a distortion, like trying to take the shape of the continents and flatten them onto the Mercator projection. It causes things to shrink and expand in ways that they really shouldn't, and that they don't represent the real world. So, in some ways, the waking state, this is the kind of Kenneth's assertion via Heraclitus, is that the waking state of douloi and benalsoi is a much less useful source of information than the actual dream state in which we're asleep and dreaming, in which you are connected to something real. It's your character. This other thing is more a projection of our character, or unintended consequences of our character. And the implication is that most people, when they say they're conscious, or when we say they're conscious, their eyes are open, they're walking around, but they're really less conscious than if they were asleep. So now they're just playing out programs and seeing what happens. And in this, there's sort of a premise that Kenneth has cited before, and David actually shared it at the very beginning. It was just a complete coincidence that he happened. The very first thing he put in the chat was from the slide I developed for back in 2021 for a presentation about the philosophy of Kenneth Smith, and I put a quote on it from one of his parables. I'm going to share it here in the chat separately too. It's from an unpublished book of his, Minotaur, from the 306th parable called The Good Soldier, in which it just reads, "There are only two kinds of philosophy, just as there are of religion, existentialist and escapist." And this is directly relevant to what he's talking about in chapter 9 here, and to our discussion of dream states, because Heraclitus argues strenuously that the weird, irreal state that we're in when we're a doulos or a benausos is something we need to get out of, because it's a kind of escape from reality. And if we want to live and thrive and do good in the world, we need to plug back into reality and learn the lessons that Mother Nature is trying to teach us about the consequences of our actions, what's really happening, and so forth. But we can't do that as long as we're hiding inside dogmatisms and ideologies and so forth, whether they're philosophical or whether they're religious. And that's why he says that he's an existentialist. This sentence, it embraces, as if it were the most complete virtue, the vice of somnambulism, going through life in a dream state. In a way, this is a restatement, or a direct, it's directly related to that Minotaur 306, and related to what he's trying to do as a philosopher, which is to say, we don't have to be afraid of reality. We have to be able to bravely face it and acknowledge what it really is. Because if we want to solve our problems, we have to understand what those problems actually are. We can't ever solve the problems as long as we keep pretending we're somewhere else and that we're not in the situation that we're in. It might feel good to minimize, what it means to die, or to minimize, how difficult a situation this nation is in politically. But if we do that, it means that all the solutions that we come up with are going to be at the wrong scale to solve this problem. If I've cracked my engine block, but I pretend I'm out of gas, I'm in for a big disappointment when I think that I can just put gas in the tank and it's going to solve my problem. I have to know the real problem I'm facing. And that's the definition of existentialism in a nutshell, that existentialism is a rejection of escapism. It is He says existentialist and escapist. He should have said existentialist or escapist. Good point, Stephen. Curse the English language. He's that's the thing is you have to make a choice, and he's choosing, trying to choose the way that Arendt and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel and Heraclitus and Aristotle and others have chosen, which is to try to directly deal with the reality as best we can. And in case one is in any doubt as to how Heraclitus felt about this, in his fragment 14, he says, one should not act or speak as if he were asleep. Like, don't escape. Just, actually face the situation that you're in. You can learn about it. You can learn to do better. You can learn to be better, but only if you actually face it. Heraclitus says, the waking have one world in common. Sleepers have each a private world of his own. And of course, now we know he's not talking about people who are literally asleep. He's just using that as a metaphor. He's saying douloi and banausoi each have a private world of their own. And they each fight with each other over who's right about how the world works, because each of them thinks that they can make the rest of the world obey their parochial or ideological perspective on the world. They're not humble enough to acknowledge that it is the world that's in charge, not us. We're not. It was here before us, and it'll be here after us. We have to understand it and harmonize with it and with each other. That's the only way forward we have. And so when he talks about the waking here, he's talking about aristoi. You see, if we can escape the traps of those two faculties of the mind, then we achieve a kind of wakefulness, at least as much as a Homo sapiens is capable of. And that wakefulness causes us to focus on the actual world that exists, and that actual world is the same world that we're all in, wakers and sleepers alike, whether we acknowledge it or not. And it has an intelligence, as he emphasizes repeatedly, it has an intelligence that was able to create every living thing around us, everything we value, everything that's important to us was generated by Mother Nature. Mother Nature's intelligence is profound. It's on a scale we can't imagine, but that we depend on. And so if we're going to tie ourselves to a shared intelligence, shouldn't it be that one and not to whatever idiocy is in our heads? We're mortals. We're pretty dumb. Ginny might praise me for my intelligence, but all I can think is, thank God people aren't doing what I insist that we do, because I'm an idiot. I'm Homo sapiens. I'm a fool. Putting me in charge would be as much of a disaster as putting anybody else in charge. If only we could somehow put Mother Nature in charge, we'd be better off. He continues. Fragment 2, this is Wheelwright puts this as fragment 2. Nobody knows if it actually came next after the opening. We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all. You see how this ties right back to fragment 15. By what is common to all, the logos, the shared understanding, Mother Nature. Yet, although the logos is common to all, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. This is that issue of the bed of Procrustes. Right, we all know the story of Theseus and the bed of Procrustes. The villain tortures people to make them fit his bed. If they're too tall, he cuts pieces off of them until they fit. If they're too short, he stretches them on it like a rack. And no matter what happens, no matter who enters his room, he kills them all by insisting that they conform to his preconceptions. And for the Greeks, this is the model for human intelligence, that we warp the things that we pretend to understand. We distort them to make them fit the bed of our minds. And it's dangerous. The only bed of the mind that could possibly fit all of the cosmos is something that a human being couldn't be capable of. It's something that would be divine, sacred. It says Mother Nature evidently is capable of figuring all this stuff out, but we are not. So man, God, and nature, that's Hegel's man, God, and nature, anthropomorphism, theism, and naturalism. It's all over Heraclitus, and it's all over Kenneth Smith. When he writes these sentences he's writing in chapter 9, it's saturated with these ideas. So when he says most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own, you have to put that together with him saying most men are as heedless and forgetful in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. So he's saying To think that you have a private intelligence, to think that you are the source of wisdom and that everybody should listen to you, is to be in a dream state. It's to be deluded. It says, at our best, we're students of life. Those are the people you can trust the most, the ones who tell you not to trust them. And the ones who tell you, I've got all the answers, you should do what I say, should run away from those people. They do not have a private intelligence of their own. The logos is shared by all of us. It's the laws of nature around us. It's not anybody's private possession. But the little bed of Procrustes in our head makes us think that what's in our mind is the correct, proper lenses and mirrors for understanding everything. All right, a few more to go. We'll work our way through the rest of this Heraclitus quickly. Oh yeah, Donna, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just a quick question. With Kenneth, I have read some stuff, bits and pieces, and I get mostly a emotional flavor that happens. The last thing you just said, it just all of a sudden went out my brain. Oh my gosh. Well, so yeah, it just flew out.
Happens to me all the time.
Oh, I did like that. But it's something about, and then I'm going backwards, and that only makes it worse going backwards. But I'm just trying to see if I can get back, because he had this flavor of like something about being in charge. I'm not going to even try. When it comes again, I'll try it again.
Yes. That none of us should be in charge because our minds are a bed of Procrustes that warps everything. So you can't trust a human being who says, I should tell you all what to do. So he's just demonstrated that he's an idiot. It's the belief that the private intelligence that's inside a mortal head is better than the laws of nature as a source of authority.
Yeah.
That's what he's talking about in
I
fragments.
know. That's, I guess in a way, that's part of what I was going to ask is that his motif? Is that so much, there's some kind of running thread to the whole thing about, yeah, I'll try it again another time. I'll try it again another time. Thanks.
No problem, Donna. That's how it is for all of us, right? But the good news is we keep circling round and round these themes, so we get more opportunities to grab that brass ring.
Yep.
It'll come around.
Thanks.
I have faith. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, I'm going to do a talk on Saturday in the Existentialist, where I'll face the dreaded atheist humanist. And my argument's going to center around this concept of anthropos. Now, you look at sort of the atheist humanists, they seem to think, well, this is one of the four horsemen, Dawkins. Oh, well, I've got a bone to pick with humanism because you're not including the other sentient life forms, and I would point out, well, that's just complete nonsense. When Dawkins is saying, oh, the rest of the life forms are our cousins. No. I could have, somebody who's actually the cousin, or I could mistakenly have any other human as my cousin. I could have an Eskimo who's mysteriously being raised in my tribe, and they could operate as my human cousin, even though they're not. But an animal can't do that. So this is where Dawkins, thinking he's a genius, just jumps completely off the rails, because as a human machine, I have something like a program which operates with other humans. There's a logic, and that logic pertains to other humans, and it'll work pretty well. I can't employ that logic with a horse or the rest of nature. It's got its own logic. When they talk about the truth, yes, we can talk about particular truths. We obviously operate in accordance with particular truths, but we can't weave all these particular truths together to make a cosmic truth, which they all seem to believe in. This is where, you know, we're all going to evolve towards the cosmic truth. Well, at the same time, they tell us they're atheists. You know, the Christians have got an argument. You know, they keep on talking about this all-powerful God, which could be nonsense. But fair enough, they've got an argument. The humanists haven't even got a basis for their claims. I mean, their claim, their humanism can only really be in the logic of anthropos. Yet they're claiming it to be universal. They're claiming that nature is subject to anthropos. They rule out the divine, but equally they'll say the divine is subject to anthropos. So Feuerbach assassinates God and says that everything we attributed to God is now the property of anthropos, and it always was. I just noticed this is missing. This is missing with the latter day rationalists. They're not really onto this aspect that the logic that we're going on about is the logic built into the species anthropos. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Greek critique of human nature. It says, you know, of man, nature, and God. The Greeks say we're at the bottom of the totem pole. We're not at the top of the totem pole. It says, have you looked around you? Did you personally evolve 4 billion years of you know, billions of forms of life? I don't think so. We're lucky if we can get our day together, if we can figure out our to-do list. That's a good day for us. I have days in which I make a to-do list and I don't get to do any of the things on the list. I mean, my level of control and intelligence is at the level of I get to the end of the evening and I, you know, took a shower and had a meal and I consider it a win. Because there are days in which I don't. You know, the level of intelligence and sanity of Homo sapiens is alien to the rest of nature. And so the Greeks come across to us like misanthropes because they say that. And moderns are like, well, the medievals overthrew nature and the moderns overthrew God. So we're betting the farm on man. So don't you dare tell us that man is not a God, is not perfect, can't solve all problems. Because if you tell us that, you're telling us we're screwed. You're telling us we made the wrong bet and we're in serious trouble. And we don't want to hear that. We don't want to think that. So there's a blind spot. All modern people have a blind spot around a tendency to overestimate human capabilities. And they do it in a way the Greeks would never have accepted. Even the medievals would never have accepted attributing so much wisdom, so much competence, so much intelligence to Homo sapiens. I mean, Heraclitus is blunt, and I've got a couple of fragments I'm going to share in a moment about the Greek perspective on human intelligence. They're right with you, Stephen. So you have a go at those humanists, and let's just see what happens. I'm sure you're going to have an enjoyable time. They might not like it as much as you do. But you know, Heraclitus is hinting at us, right? Here's fragment 64. Although intimately connected with the logos, because you know, it's nature and we're in it. Also, we're made of it. Men keep setting themselves against it. They keep setting themselves against it. We keep doing the things that create dissonance instead of harmony. He then goes on, listening not to me, but to the logos. It is wise to acknowledge that all things are one. This goes back to his thing about there's a common intelligence in nature, but there's split up separate intelligences in people who are sleepwalking through life because of their ideologies or because of their parochialisms. And that splitting up creates a big problem for us. It's not such a problem for a cheetah because the cheetah carries its sophrosune with it. But we can only approximate sophrosune with enthusiasm that we get from acculturating each other. In isolation, we are often big problems. He says, men who love wisdom should acquaint themselves with a great many particulars. I've come to think of particulars in a Hegelian sense as concrete particulars. You know, actually learn things about the real world, learn the details of the real world. Notice the difference between the rotten apple and the healthy apple. Don't just say two apples. You know, immerse yourself in the complexity and intelligence of what's going on, and it will temper us and change us. It'll give us a chance to jar us loose from our sleepwalking. He says, To be temperate is the greatest virtue. Wisdom consists in speaking and acting the truth, giving heed to the nature of things. And as he said earlier, you can't give heed to the nature of things if you're sleepwalking through life. So again, this is getting at what are the Greeks worried about with letting the douloi and the banausoi be in charge? It's that they don't give heed to the nature of things. Compare that to the verbs used in the first fragment. He said, he says, other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless. There's heeding again. Forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. The failure to give heed to the nature of things means that you deal with things not as they actually exist, but as we fantasize them, either because of our appetites and experiences or because our theories need them to be a certain way, whether we like it or not. Then we come to the paraphragments in which Heraclitus says exactly what Stephen was just talking about. 61, human nature has no real understanding. No real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. And 62, man is not rational. Only what encompasses him is intelligent. Well, what are these two fragments talking about? Well, they're talking about man, God, and nature, right? Human nature is man. Divine nature is God. Man is man. And what encompasses man is nature, the nature around us and the nature within us. It encompasses us from both sides. That has real understanding. That is intelligent. But what we're doing with our 7 plus or minus 2, registers of our conscious mind at our best, down to 3 or just 1 when we're, hungover and exhausted, that's not enough to represent the real world in. It can only be a kind of dream state of varying levels of lucidity. So he's agreeing with you about the dangers with homosexuality. We are a different kind of creature than most natural animals. And we relate to each other differently, and we relate to ourselves differently, and we relate to the world differently. This goes hand in hand with that thing we said earlier about, to the Greeks, mortality has every bit as much to do with our inability to be intelligent as it does with, whether we die or not. We just aren't around long enough.
Well, we have a different logic.
We have a different logic. We have a completely different logic. There is something of the artificial that is intrinsic to the way that we develop values. And without that artifice and that acculturation, we're in chaos. And trees don't seem to have that problem. They carry their values around inside them in a way that we don't.
Well, it's even between different cultures.
Yes.
Medieval Viking, medieval Japanese, on the gut level, they have the same logic, but when it comes to their abstract values, these can be different.
Exactly. And that makes us totally different from cheetahs, which, whether they're in Asia or Africa or wherever the hell they are, they share the same value system. They're cheetahs. It's an instinctive value system for them, whereas we have to be acculturated into our value systems, which means we all end up different depending on our culture.
Woe beside the multiculturalist who believes that the different cultures will live peacefully together when history is replete with examples that they don't. So, I mean, in Dark Ages England, even the towns, if they had different sorts of cultures, they had a Danish quarter in the Saxon towns,
Right?
because it's sort of like even these people. Well, it's like the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants.
Yes.
They look very similar, but yes.
Right? I mean, what are values? What matters? What's important? If I think something's important and you think it's horrible and disgusting, we got a problem, don't we?
Well, it's Monty Python. Do not mistake Yorkshiremen for Englishmen.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Donna, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, kind of remembered. So, how much does Kenneth put weight on the conditioning of brainwashing of the powers that be toward the mass at large for the problems that we have with this sleepwalking, unconsciousness, etc.
Yeah, he would see that as a central concern.
It
I mean,
seemed that way from what I was reading, but I wasn't sure how much throughout his whole, even lifespan, how much weight he puts on that. I know there's definitely a fault for us not tipping that balance, et cetera, et cetera. But I got a glimpse of that from him, and I'm thinking, and not that it's the first time I thought it, but it's just I think so very much we don't focus on that because it's very threatening, and it was meant to be threatening, it was conditioned. But there's that fact, and he's an intellect. He knows about power. He's got that, so he's more in touch with that than I would be, as far as the culpability of the brainwashing and conditioning and why this is the way it is.
yes, yes. There's an interesting passage in Marx. I talk about it now and then. I don't usually cite a lot of Marx on these calls, but there's an interesting passage in Marx where he says it's tempting for people to see the proletariat as the good guys who are the heroes of the story, and the bourgeoisie as the bad guys who are deliberately oppressing them because they're bad guys.
Right.
And he says, and that under capitalism, the proletariat doesn't get anything that they need, and that the bourgeoisie gets everything that they need and want. He says, but the truth is, the problem with capitalism is that nobody gets everything that they need and they want. Is that we're split in such a way that the two classes each live a half human life,
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
which the bourgeoisie get to own everything, but they don't get to create anything. They're too, I mean, if they, any moment that they take away from their spreadsheets and their plans and their strategies for domination is, to go plant a garden or to build a house is a moment that their competitor is out there beating them.
Totally. Yeah.
So they have to become obsessed with what it takes to own and to rule and to dominate and to plan. And the result is for a species that evolved in order to improve its life through the action of its own hands, it's devastating psychologically to be an owner but not a maker. And every bit as devastating as it is, he says, for the proletariat to be relentlessly making and never getting to own anything that they make, to always being alienated from the stuff that they create. So this psychological aspect, this characterological aspect, this aspect of, and this gets to what Stephen was just talking about, this aspect of what do we need as a species? How do we work as a species? He's like, that's what you're asking about, Donna, is the fundamental question. How have we been acculturated to value the things we value, to do the things we do, and to not value the things we don't value, even if the things we don't value are actually the things that we need, but we've been taught they aren't.
But there's the few versus the many. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, and I'm just curious for future conversations, if it ever comes up, about where Kenneth is at with, even as an example, I mean, not concrete example, but the process of eugenicide, just the few, like the Lord of the Flies is what I think of all the time. I mean, this is just the survivalistic thing is
Yeah.
just the thing that'll go on to the last person standing.
Yeah.
And
He wrote a whole book about the question you're asking.
oh, okay,
It's called The Crypto Revolution of our Age,
okay,
also called End Times.
oh, okay.
No. It has another name. But anyway, Crypto Revolution of Our Age. It diagnoses how we got where we are today.
Hmm.
But all of the stuff that we're talking about in Millennia Microcosm sets that book up.
Okay.
So, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's a central concern that he has about. He'd say this is one of the things. Stephen critiques Marxism frequently, and Kenneth would say one of the biggest things that's missing from Marxism is that it spends so much time focusing on the economic relationships that it misses what do people think that they're doing? What do they believe they're doing? Why do they buy into the things they buy into? Why do they act the way they act? And a whole bunch of that's missing.
Well, the threat of annihilation, the threat of pain, the threat, I mean, those who wield the power and can hurt someone, I mean, it comes down to that, doesn't it? Who can
Well,
hurt someone else? And
that would be the Marxist analysis, is that there's a direct threat. But when we actually look around the streets, we see that there's only a few police compared to the number of people. It's
well, I
mostly
mean,
we
yeah,
comply. we
Right.
comply.
But we've
Right?
learned evolutionary, our brain has learned, how to stay safe and survive versus, because you're out of here really soon if 'cause it's unspoken. I don't know what to say. I just feel like yeah, it's a thing. It's for animals too, not just us. It's just,
Yeah. He'd say we're
I
creating this
think,
together. Even the people who are suffering the most contribute to it without knowing that we're contributing to it.
we do at one level. I guess I'm looking at the real pivotal level, the leverage of the pivot point.
Yeah. There's
Um,
certainly a gun or a fist back there somewhere.
yeah, that's what I'm just trying to say. There's a gun and a fist. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. But frequently it's not present at the time that we comply.
Correct.
And the
Correct.
result is we're frequently acting in anticipation of the gun or the fist, even
Correct.
when not
Correct.
only is it not there, it can't even be brought to bear, but we still obey because we,
There's where I'm talking about. Thanks. That's what I was talking about, and I wondered what Kenneth you said about that. Yeah.
yeah, we'll talk about that a lot
Okay.
over the years ahead.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks. I guess the last word's going to go to Donald. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was going to say to Donna that I don't know how Kenneth's philosophy translates to, say, contemporary political issues. That's not really what he's addressing. I mean, not that you wouldn't have some ideas on it, perhaps, but
Yeah, I wasn't thinking.
I mean, he would say there's nobody present capable of ruling.
Well, it's existential, and I think that actually, if we really get, I mean, I wish I could use one of those words that came up today to say it's an existential knowing of where the power is and what the nature of it is and what we got to do to stay alive. So at large, in the whole world, it doesn't have to be political, contemporary. It's just the nature of something, power,
Well,
whatever.
I think he thinks things are pretty screwed up, and that it has deep causes that aren't easily overcome.
Right. Those are the forces I'm talking. That's what I'm talking about. The stuff that's not even.
Like this whole. He has quite a lot on what he calls characterology. Of the douloi, the bonosoi, and the aristoi, but we just don't. What solutions, if there were an aristic ruling class, what solutions they would come to? I'm not sure Kenneth would say anything about that other than that how could he know? You're talking about reconstituting society with different ruling principles that would put different people in charge. I mean, and do we even have any of those people? Or where would we go get them? They're not sitting on the bench waiting for the coach to say, "Oh, okay, it's time for you to go in." I don't know. I can't. I don't. In many ways, I don't want to say too much. I've argued with Kenneth about politics many times, and I don't know what he thinks. I'm some troglodyte or something, but Kenneth doesn't need to be ruled. He is a self-ruling person. He is not one of the people that was only well ruled the first 9 months of his life, or something, as George Bernard Shaw, as we referenced earlier, something like that. He's a person that rules himself just fine, and his family just fine. He doesn't need to be ruled. He is not douloi, he is not banausic. He is aristic, although he doesn't play an aristic role in society other than being self-ruling. And I suspect many people on this group, this is probably one of the concentrations of people that by and large don't need a ruler. They would run their lives for themselves pretty well.
You're excessively optimistic.
Well, it's only you. That's why I said most people, Stephen. I have concerns for Australia. No, no, I, I mean, some people can't develop a moral code and live by it, and can't think about what it might even mean to live by principles, or to try and seek them out, or find them, or search them, or learn them from somebody who's already got them. I don't know. It's like Kenneth is very diagnostic. If you want to know, reading him to figure out what went wrong, it's like when I read Marx. I say, golly, this guy understood so much, such a diagnostician about the problems of capitalism. And yet, everyone who's tried to build a society on top of Marxism, has produced something that's catastrophic. So it's like, how can you understand so much? But that doesn't mean, that you can diagnose the illness. Doesn't mean that somehow you're just being coy about, well, I just don't want to bring out the solution. I really had it. I mean, this is a common, in Plato, characters are always critiquing Socrates. Oh, you're just asking these questions. These are fake questions, You really know the answer. And you could just tell us, And they refuse to take Socrates' questioning, his need to examine his life, seriously as a mode of existence, because, well, they know the answers to the questions they ask. Surely he must. And I think, Kenneth wouldn't be silent. But usually when it comes down to the U.S., the choices we have are prudential. We're not choosing between good and evil. we're choosing between less evils, or slightly more good, or things like that. And so
I'm just afraid this idea, or this belief that we'll find a perfect set of ideas, a perfect set of answers.
I don't.
Schopenhauer pointed out he thought the will was more important. Nietzsche seemed to agree with him that you can't have a perfect plan unless you've got a will to do it. So you need the will. A perfect set of ideas on its own, it's not going to work.
That.
Well, I'll put it this way. People believe that they passively react to reality. And yeah, you can say it's a certain passivity, but in actual fact, you are always being sympathetic and antipathetic to reality. One day you love Jews, the next day you hate Jews, and it dramatically changes your outlook.
The subjective experience of being human. Our feelings pull us one way and then they pull us another.
Well,
On that note, I actually have to pull the plug today because we're at quarter after. We're at quarter after.
You got me all wound up.
I know, at the wrong time.
Go and have an after dinner mint like they do at the movie theaters.
Vitamins. Yes, the vitamins. So we'll pick this up again next week. And next week we'll also be starting into Galatians. Paul has some astonishing things to say in Galatians, which we'll talk about as well as continue where we left off here. So I hope you have a great week. I had a lovely time. I hope you
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.